There's something about curiosity that makes you ignore warning signs you'd normally pay attention to. Looking back, I can see exactly where I should have stopped, where any reasonable person would have closed their laptop and walked away. But I didn't, and now I'm living with the consequences. Last summer, I was working as a dental receptionist in Southampton. Not the most exciting job in the world, but it paid the bills and gave me enough free time to pursue my actual interest, which was photography. I'd been doing it semi-professionally for a few years, mostly portraits and the occasional wedding. Nothing that would make me rich, but enough to supplement my income. The practice where I worked was in the city centre, and my flat was about 20 minutes away on foot. I lived alone, which suited me fine. I'd always been fairly independent, preferred my own company most of the time. Evenings were usually spent editing photos or browsing online, looking at other photographers' work, trying to pick up new techniques. One evening in July, I was looking at a photography discussion site when someone mentioned something called verification services on the dark web. The context was about stock photography and licensing. Someone asking whether there were ways to check if your images were being used without permission in places normal search engines couldn't reach. Another user mentioned that there were services on the dark web that could do reverse image searches across databases most people couldn't access. I'd heard of the dark web before, obviously. Everyone has. But like most people, I'd assumed it was either completely inaccessible or exclusively used for illegal things. The discussion made it sound more mundane than that. People used it for privacy reasons, for accessing information in countries with restricted internet, for legitimate purposes alongside the dodgy ones. I was curious. I had hundreds of photos online across various platforms, and I'd always wondered if people were using them without permission. The standard reverse image search tools only showed you what was publicly indexed. There could be dozens of sites using my work that I'd never find through normal means, so I looked into it. Getting access was easier than I'd expected. Within half an hour, I was browsing this completely different version of the internet. Most of it was disappointing. Broken links, sites that looked ancient, pages that loaded incredibly slowly or not at all. I spent maybe an hour clicking around before I found what I was looking for. The site was called Image Trace. Simple name, simple design. The homepage explained that it was a reverse image search service that could scan databases and repositories most search engines couldn't reach. Upload an image, wait for the results, see where it appeared online. There was a fee structure listed, but it also mentioned you could earn credits by contributing to their verification system. That caught my attention. I didn't particularly want to pay for a service I was just experimenting with, but earning credits sounded reasonable. There was a link. Become a verifier. I clicked through. The page explained that the service needed human verification for certain types of image matching. Their automated system could find potential matches, but humans were better at confirming whether two images were actually the same or just similar. Verifiers would be shown pairs of images and asked to rate how closely they matched. Each verification earned a small number of credits. Accumulate enough credits, and you could use the service to search for your own images. It seemed straightforward enough. Look at some images, say whether they match, earn credits. Use those credits to search for my photographs. A fair exchange. I signed up using a temporary email address. The registration process asked for some basic information: general location, languages spoken, areas of expertise. I put down Southampton, English, and photography. Then I confirmed my registration and was taken to a dashboard. The interface was clean and functional. At the top was my credit balance, 0. Below that was a button. Begin verification tasks. I clicked it. The first task appeared immediately. 2 photographs side by side. On the left was a picture of a street scene, clearly taken in some European city. On the right was a similar but not identical image of what looked like the same street from a slightly different angle. Below each image was a question. Are these images of the same location? There were 5 options. Definitely yes, probably yes, uncertain, probably no, definitely no. I looked at both images carefully. The buildings matched. The street layout was the same. The angles were different, suggesting they'd been taken from different positions, but they were definitely the same location. I clicked definitely yes and submitted my answer. A new pair of images appeared. This time 2 portraits of different people. The question was the same. Are these images of the same person? They clearly weren't. Different facial features, different ages, different everything. I clicked, definitely no. Another pair appeared, then another, then another. Most were easy to judge. Landscapes that were obviously the same place or obviously different. Portraits of the same person taken years apart versus portraits of completely different people. Buildings, cars, objects. Some required more thought, particularly when the images were poor quality or taken from strange angles, but generally it was straightforward work. After about 30 minutes, I'd completed maybe 50 verifications. My credit balance had increased accordingly. Each verification earned a fractional credit, and I needed roughly 100 credits to run a basic image search. At this rate, it would take a few hours of work to accumulate enough. Tedious, but not difficult. I stopped for the evening and came back to it the next day. Completed another 50 verifications. Then another batch the day after that. Within a week, I had enough credits to run my first search. I uploaded one of my more popular photographs, a sunset shot over Southampton docks that I'd taken a couple of years earlier. The search ran for maybe 30 seconds, then returned results. It found the image on my own website, obviously, on my social media accounts, on a few photography sharing sites where I'd posted it, all expected. But it also found 3 other locations. A blog based in Germany that had used the image without credit, a tourism website for the South Coast that had taken it from somewhere and used it in a promotional article, and a stock photography site I'd never heard of, selling prints of my photograph. I felt a mixture of vindication and annoyance. I'd been right to be suspicious. People were using my work without permission. The verifications had been worth it. I ran a few more searches over the following days, checking other images from my portfolio. Found similar results. A few unauthorized uses, mostly small-scale stuff that probably wasn't worth pursuing legally, but good to know about nonetheless. Then the verification tasks started changing. I'd been working through them one evening, mindlessly clicking through pairs of images, when something made me pause. The images weren't photographs anymore. They were screenshots. On the left was a screenshot of what looked like a text conversation. On the right was another screenshot, similar but with slightly different text. The question had changed too. Do these conversations involve the same participants? I stared at the screen for a moment. This wasn't what I'd signed up for. I'd agreed to verify image matches, not analyze private conversations. But the task was already loaded, and there was no obvious way to skip it without losing my progress. I looked at the screenshots more carefully. The text was in English. The conversation on the left appeared to be between 2 people discussing meeting up somewhere. The conversation on the right showed different text, but similar phrasing, similar topics. Without names or profile pictures visible, it was impossible to tell if they involved the same people. I clicked uncertain and submitted. A new task appeared. This time it was 2 photographs of documents. Official-looking forms with most of the text blurred out, but enough visible to see they were some kind of application or registration documents. The question: are these documents from the same source? Again, impossible to tell with most of the information obscured. I clicked uncertain again. More tasks appeared, and they were increasingly strange. Screenshots of emails with identifying information blurred. Photographs of buildings with the question, is this a residential property? Aerial images of locations with questions about whether they showed the same area. None of it was related to photography anymore. None of it matched what the service had claimed to be about. I should have stopped then. But I'd already accumulated credits. I'd already invested time. And the tasks kept coming, each one earning me more credits, each one seemingly harmless on its own. Then I got a task that made me feel physically sick. 2 photographs appeared. Both showed the interior of what looked like someone's home. A living room with a sofa, a television, some personal belongings visible. The images were taken from slightly different angles, but clearly showed the same room. The question: are these images from the same location? But there was something else in one of the photos. In the corner, partially visible, was a person. Just their arm and part of their torso sitting on the sofa. They clearly didn't know they were being photographed. The angle suggested the photo had been taken from outside, through a window. I closed the laptop immediately, sat there feeling cold and nauseous, trying to process what I'd just seen. The service wasn't about copyright verification. It was about surveillance. All those tasks I'd been completing, all those verifications, I'd been helping someone identify locations, match images of properties, confirm whether different photographs showed the same places or people. I'd been contributing to some kind of organized information gathering operation. I didn't log back in for several days. Tried to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, about all the tasks I'd completed, about what that information might have been used for. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I logged back into the dashboard. My credit balance was still there. The verification tasks were still available. I clicked to begin a new task, morbidly curious about what would appear. The task that loaded made my stomach drop. 2 photographs side by side. On the left was a street scene, a residential street with terraced houses. On the right was a closer shot of one specific house on what looked like the same street. I recognized the street immediately. It was my street. The left image showed the full length of the road where I lived. The right image showed a house 3 doors down from mine. The question: are these images from the same location? I sat frozen, staring at the screen. Someone had photographed my street, had uploaded it to this service, was asking verifiers to confirm location details about the area where I lived. I clicked definitely yes without thinking, submitted the answer, immediately regretted it. A new task appeared. This time the left image showed the same street from a different angle. The right image showed another house. 2 doors down from mine, same question. I closed the laptop. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was systematically documenting my street, breaking it down into individual properties, having each one verified by people like me who had no idea what they were contributing to. I checked the dashboard again the next day. My task history was visible in a section I hadn't noticed before. It showed every verification I'd completed, going back to my first day. Hundreds of them now, and next to each one was a status indicator. Verified, pending or confirmed. The tasks showing my street were marked as confirmed. Multiple verifiers had looked at those images and confirmed the locations matched. Not just me. Others had seen the same tasks and provided the same answers. I scrolled through my task history, looking at everything I'd verified over the past few weeks. Most of it seemed innocuous in isolation. 2 images of the same building, 2 portraits of the same person, 2 screenshots of similar conversations. But seeing them all listed together, I started noticing patterns. Certain locations appeared multiple times. The same street photographed from different angles. The same building shown in different lighting conditions. The same car park at different times of day. Someone was building comprehensive documentation of specific places, using verifiers to confirm accuracy and match details across multiple images. And my street was one of those places. Over the next few days, more tasks appeared involving my area. Not just my street now, but surrounding roads, nearby shops, the park at the end of my road. Each time, I was asked to verify location matches, confirm that different images showed the same places. I stopped completing those tasks, started declining them, clicking uncertain, even when I knew the answer. But it didn't matter. Other verifiers were still completing them. The tasks still showed as confirmed in my history. Then something happened that made everything worse. I was walking home from work one afternoon, the usual route through the city centre and then residential streets toward my flat. As I turned onto my road, I noticed someone standing on the corner. A man, maybe in his 30s, holding a phone up like he was taking photographs. I walked past him, trying to look casual. Glanced back once I'd passed. He was still there, phone raised, photographing the street. It could have been innocent, could have been a tourist, or someone documenting the area for personal reasons. But the timing felt wrong, too coincidental. I went into my flat and immediately opened my laptop, logged into the dashboard, refreshed the verification tasks. New tasks had appeared, photographs of my street taken from the exact spot where I'd seen that man standing. Different houses shown in each image, including mine. The tasks were already being verified by other users, already marked as confirmed. I was watching it happen in real time. Someone photographing my street, uploading the images, having them verified and catalogued within minutes. I tried to delete my account. The option wasn't available. I looked through every settings menu, every configuration page. There was no way to remove my account or even stop receiving tasks. I sent a message through the site's contact form, demanding they delete my information and remove my account. No response came. The tasks kept appearing. More images of my street, my building, my neighborhood. And they weren't just external shots anymore. Some showed views through windows, interior shots of buildings on my road taken from outside, photographs of gardens, driveways, the alley behind the houses. Then I received a task that showed my actual flat, not the building, but my specific flat. A photograph taken through my living room window, showing my furniture, my belongings. The question: is this a ground floor or upper floor property? The answer was obvious from the angle. Upper floor, second floor specifically. But I couldn't bring myself to answer. I just stared at the image, at my own living room displayed on this site, being catalogued and verified by strangers. I closed my curtains, all of them, stopped opening them even during the day, started avoiding the windows entirely. But the tasks kept coming. My building from different angles, the entrance where I came and went, the window of my flat, my car in the residence parking area, each one being verified, confirmed. added to whatever database this service was building. I tried to work out who was behind it, went back through the site, looking for any information about the company or organization running Image Trace. There was nothing. No contact details beyond the form I'd already used. No company registration. No terms of service that mentioned who owned or operated the site. I looked up the service on normal search engines, found nothing. It didn't exist outside the dark web. No reviews, no discussions, no mentions anywhere. I was trapped in something I didn't understand, couldn't escape, and couldn't report to anyone without admitting I'd been participating in it. Then the tasks changed again. One evening, a new task appeared, a photograph of me, actually me, walking down my street, taken from behind, but clearly me. I recognized my jacket, my bag, my posture. The question: identify the individual's approximate height and build. Options were provided: short, average, tall, slim, average, heavy. I closed the laptop so hard I thought the screen might crack. They weren't just cataloging locations anymore. They were cataloging people, specifically me. More tasks appeared over the following days. Different photographs of me at different locations. Walking to work, sitting in a cafe, waiting at a bus stop. Each one asking verifiers to provide details about me. What I was wearing, what I was carrying, what time of day it was. Other verifiers were answering these questions, providing details about me to whoever was compiling this information. And I couldn't stop them because I couldn't access the site without seeing more tasks. And I couldn't delete my account or remove my information. I changed my routine, started taking different routes to work, avoided my usual haunts, wore different clothes, anything to make myself less predictable, less documentable. But the photographs kept appearing. New locations, new times. They were following me, photographing me, uploading everything to the site for verification. I went to the police, told them someone was following me and taking photographs. They asked if I knew who or why. I said no. I couldn't tell them about Image Trace without explaining how I knew about it, without admitting I'd been verifying similar images of other people and places for weeks. They said they'd keep a record of my report, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They suggested I be vigilant, maybe install a camera, keep a log of incidents. I did install a camera, pointed it at my front door. The next morning, I checked the footage. Someone had stood outside my door at 3 a.m, just stood there for maybe 10 minutes, doing something with their phone, then left. I checked the dashboard. New tasks had appeared, photographs of my door, my flat number visible in the images, questions about the lock type, whether there was a security chain, whether the door opened inward or outward. They were planning something, gathering information for some purpose I didn't want to contemplate. I moved out the following week, broke my lease, paid whatever penalties the landlord demanded, found a new flat across the city in Eastleigh. Didn't tell anyone where I was going except my employer, and I made them promise not to give out my information to anyone. For a few weeks, everything seemed fine. No tasks appeared showing my new location. No photographs of my new street. I started to relax slightly, thinking maybe I'd escaped it. Then I logged into the dashboard one morning, something I'd been doing compulsively despite knowing I should stop, and found my new address listed in my profile information. I hadn't provided it. I'd never updated my details, but somehow the site knew where I'd moved to. The verification tasks started appearing that same day. My new street, my new building, my new flat, all being photographed, uploaded, verified, catalogued. And there was a new section in my dashboard now. Accuracy score. it showed a percentage. Mine was listed as 93%. Below it was text. Users with accuracy scores above 90% are eligible for premium verification tasks. A new button had appeared. Accept premium tasks. I didn't click it. I closed the laptop and haven't opened that site since. But the damage is done. My information is in their system. My locations, my routines, my details. All verified by strangers who have no idea what they're contributing to. Just like I had no idea when I started. I've moved twice more since then. Each time, within days, tasks appear showing my new location. Each time, the photographs start arriving. The documentation continues. I don't know who's behind it. I don't know what they want. I don't know if I'm specifically targeted or if I'm just one of many people being catalogued this way. What I do know is that I helped build the system that's now being used against me. Every verification I completed, every task I answered, I was training their system, teaching it to identify locations and people and details. I was one of dozens or hundreds of verifiers, all contributing small pieces to something much larger that none of us understood. And now I can't escape it. Can't delete my involvement. Can't undo the verification work I did. It's all permanent, all catalogued, all being used for purposes I never agreed to, and still don't understand. The worst part is knowing that somewhere right now, someone is looking at a verification task. 2 images side by side. One showing a street or a building or a person, the other showing something similar. And they're being asked to confirm if they match. They'll answer honestly, trying to help, thinking they're contributing to something legitimate. And they'll have no idea what they're really doing until it's far too late. Just like I didn't. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sorting through job applications at my kitchen table in Coventry. Laptop balanced between takeaway containers and bills I'd been avoiding since my redundancy 3 months earlier. At first glance, it looked like any other freelance opportunity. Polite, professional, asking about my background in market research and whether I might be interested in participating in a consumer behavior study. The sender claimed to be conducting research into how adults discover and evaluate information sources, particularly in the digital age. It was the payment offer that caught my attention. £200 for a few hours of guided internet research, considerably more than I'd been earning from the occasional survey work that kept me barely solvent. The postscript made me pause though. Given your background in consumer analysis, your insights into alternative information discovery methods would be particularly valuable. I'd never specialized in alternative information discovery. My market research experience was entirely conventional. Focus groups, consumer surveys, brand perception studies. Nothing that would suggest expertise in whatever they meant by alternative methods. I replied cautiously, asking for more details about the research project and what exactly they meant by alternative information discovery. The response came within hours, including what appeared to be legitimate academic credentials and a brief outline of their study into how consumers find information outside mainstream channels. They were particularly interested in how people without technical backgrounds navigate what they called unconventional information sources, content that exists beyond normal search engines and social media platforms, but doesn't require specialized knowledge to access. The research would involve guided exploration of various information communities, documenting my reactions and observations about content quality, reliability, and user experience, all conducted remotely with appropriate safety precautions. It seemed straightforward enough. I'd certainly spent enough time recently searching for job opportunities and financial advice through every possible channel. Understanding how people find reliable information in an ocean of digital noise was clearly valuable research. We arranged a video call for the following weekend. The researcher who appeared on screen looked exactly as I'd expected. Early 30s, professional but slightly academic, comfortable with technology. They asked thoughtful questions about my market research background, approaches to evaluating information reliability, experience with different types of online communities. About halfway through the interview, they shifted focus, asked whether I'd ever encountered information sources that seemed to exist parallel to mainstream internet content, communities or resources that weren't indexed by normal search engines but contained genuinely useful material. I admitted that during my recent job searching, I'd occasionally found leads through sources that weren't obvious from standard career websites. Nothing dramatic, just recommendations and opportunities that seemed to circulate through networks I wasn't normally part of. The researcher seemed particularly interested in this observation, asked whether I'd ever felt curious about these hidden networks, whether I'd considered exploring them more systematically to understand what information they contained. I explained that my technical knowledge was limited to basic computer use. I wouldn't know how to access hidden networks even if I wanted to. The researcher smiled and suggested this might actually be perfect for their research. They were looking for people who could document the experience of discovering hidden information communities from a complete beginner's perspective. Technical experts often had too much prior knowledge to provide genuine first-time reactions to what they found. Would I be interested in participating in guided exploration of some hidden information networks with detailed safety instructions to help them understand how non-technical adults might react to content that existed outside mainstream channels? The request felt like a natural extension of our discussion about information discovery. Understanding hidden networks would certainly be valuable knowledge, especially if they contain opportunities or resources that weren't available through conventional channels. They provided detailed instructions for accessing hidden services safely, emphasizing that we'd only visit communities focused on information sharing rather than anything obviously problematic. Academic research, essentially, conducted with proper precautions. The software installation was more complex than regular internet browsing, but their instructions were clear enough that I managed it without major difficulty. They'd provided a list of addresses for communities they'd already verified as appropriate for research purposes. The first few sites were disappointingly mundane. Discussion groups about privacy rights, archives of historical documents, communities focused on information that had been censored or suppressed. Exactly the sort of content you'd expect researchers to study. But as I explored more widely, following links and recommendations from these initial communities, I began encountering material that was considerably more interesting from a market research perspective. Not illegal content, but documentation of business practices and corporate activities that weren't being reported through mainstream business media. Internal communications from major companies, documentation of regulatory violations, communities discussing market manipulation and consumer deception techniques. The researcher had asked me to document my reactions to this material, particularly focusing on how it might influence consumer decision-making. They were especially interested in psychological responses. What felt credible, what seemed actionable, how exposure might change someone's approach to purchasing decisions. I found myself spending hours exploring these hidden business communities, taking notes about information quality and community structures, trying to analyze what made certain claims feel more reliable than obvious conspiracy theories. Some communities hosted real-time discussions about corporate activities that weren't being covered in financial news. Others shared documentation of consumer rights violations that had been settled quietly, without public disclosure. The line between legitimate business journalism and corporate conspiracy theories was often difficult to determine. One community that particularly caught my attention focused on what they called local business intelligence, members sharing information about companies and organizations in their immediate geographic areas that wasn't appearing in local business press. The UK section contained posts about businesses in various cities and towns, often with financial documentation or regulatory filings supporting claims that weren't receiving broader attention. I found myself checking this community regularly, curious about whether anything would appear relating to Coventry or the West Midlands business community I was trying to break back into. About 3 weeks into my exploration, someone posted a series of documents that made my stomach drop. The files contained detailed financial information about the recruitment agency I'd been working with since my redundancy. Not just general business data, but specific records of their client relationships and fee structures that revealed practices that were definitely not being disclosed to job seekers. The post claimed that several local recruitment agencies were operating what amounted to employment fraud schemes, charging fees to employers for services that weren't being provided, while manipulating job seekers into accepting positions that didn't match advertised terms. Most disturbing were internal communications suggesting that some agencies were deliberately prolonging unemployment for certain candidates to maximize government subsidy payments while maintaining the appearance of active job placement efforts. I recognized names and companies from my own job search experience. Agencies that had promised opportunities that never materialized, positions that had been filled internally after lengthy application processes, interviews that seemed designed to waste time rather than evaluate candidates. The documentation suggested a systematic approach to exploiting both unemployed individuals and the government systems designed to support them. Professional fraud disguised as legitimate employment services. I should have reported the information to relevant authorities immediately, but I was concerned about explaining how I'd discovered the documents without revealing my participation in research that might be considered inappropriate or potentially illegal. Instead, I started paying closer attention to my interactions with recruitment agencies, looking for signs of the deceptive practices the hidden community had documented. I noticed things I'd previously attributed to normal business inefficiency. Deliberately vague job descriptions that allowed agencies to claim positions had been filled by internal candidates. Interview processes that seemed designed to gather personal information rather than assess qualifications, requirements for financial disclosure that weren't standard practice. Most significantly, I realized that several agencies had been coordinating their responses to my applications, ensuring that I remained in a cycle of near-miss opportunities that maintained hope while preventing actual employment. I began documenting these interactions more carefully, creating records of conversations and email exchanges that revealed patterns of deliberate manipulation. What I discovered confirmed the hidden community's allegations about systematic employment fraud. The agencies were indeed operating coordinated schemes designed to exploit both job seekers and government funding systems. They maintained databases of long-term unemployed individuals who could be cycled through fake opportunities to justify continued subsidy payments while ensuring these people never actually obtained stable employment. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated, designed to maintain motivation and compliance while preventing the sort of genuine job placement that would remove candidates from the system. I researched the hidden community more thoroughly, trying to understand who was posting this information and why they were documenting employment fraud specifically. The community structure was more complex than I'd initially realized. Members weren't just sharing random business intelligence, but appeared to be conducting systematic investigation of corporate practices that weren't receiving official scrutiny. Some posts included detailed analysis of regulatory capture, suggesting that employment fraud was continuing, because oversight bodies were staffed by people with financial interests in maintaining current systems. The documentation quality was often professional, including forensic accounting analysis and cross-referencing of information from multiple sources. This wasn't casual whistleblowing, but something approaching genuine investigative journalism. I found posts about similar employment fraud schemes in different cities, suggesting this wasn't isolated to Coventry, but part of a broader pattern affecting unemployed people across the UK. The scope indicated that employment fraud had become institutionalized, with government systems inadvertently funding schemes that perpetuated unemployment while appearing to address it. I started contributing my own documentation to the community, sharing evidence about recruitment agency practices without identifying specific individuals or companies. The response was immediate and encouraging. Other members provided additional context and suggested methods for gathering more comprehensive evidence. They also warned me about potential risks of investigating too openly. Several contributors mentioned experiencing retaliation after their documentation had led to official scrutiny, blacklisting from employment agencies, credit rating problems, even legal threats from companies that didn't appreciate unwanted attention. The advice was to document carefully but discreetly, avoid direct confrontation with agencies involved in fraudulent practices, and be prepared for professional retaliation if my investigation became known to the wrong people. This advice proved prescient sooner than I'd expected. About a month after I'd started contributing to the community, I received a phone call that made it clear my activities hadn't gone unnoticed. Not through the hidden community itself, but from someone claiming to represent a professional standards body for recruitment agencies. A polite inquiry about my recent experiences with local employment services, asking whether I'd encountered any practices that concerned me. The caller included enough specific details about my job search activities to make it obvious that my interactions with various agencies had been more closely monitored than I'd realized. Someone had been tracking my applications, interview attendance, even my communication patterns with different agencies. They suggested a meeting to discuss my concerns in a confidential setting, where I could provide feedback about recruitment industry practices without worrying about professional repercussions. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at a location away from any employment agency, a conference room in a business center that seemed designed for sensitive discussions requiring privacy. I should have declined the meeting and reported everything I discovered to proper authorities, instead of participating in what felt increasingly like an investigation, operating outside normal oversight. But I was curious about who these people were and what exactly they knew about my activities. More importantly, I needed to understand whether my employment prospects were being deliberately sabotaged and by whom. The meeting location was exactly as impersonal as I'd expected. Generic business center, anonymous conference room, the sort of space designed for discussions that participants might want to forget. 2 people were waiting when I arrived. Professional appearance, polite demeanor, the sort of individuals you might expect from any industry oversight body. They thanked me for coming and explained that they were investigating concerns about recruitment industry practices affecting long-term unemployed individuals. My documentation had been valuable, they assured me, helping them understand the scope of practices that weren't being properly regulated or reported through official channels. They asked detailed questions about what I'd experienced, which agencies I'd worked with, what documentation I'd gathered about their practices. Their knowledge of the recruitment industry was comprehensive, suggesting either extensive research or direct involvement in employment services. About halfway through the discussion, they shifted focus to my research activities, asked about my exploration of hidden business communities, my participation in documentation projects, my communication with other people investigating employment fraud. They seemed particularly interested in the community where I'd first seen documents about recruitment agencies, asking whether I'd identified other contributors or learned about similar investigations in different regions. Their questions became increasingly specific about my technical knowledge and methods for accessing hidden services. Not accusatory, but thorough enough to suggest they understood exactly what I'd been doing and possibly who I'd been communicating with. Eventually, they explained the real purpose of our meeting. The practices I documented were part of an authorized pilot program studying long-term unemployment intervention strategies. The recruitment agencies were participating in research designed to understand how employment services could be improved for difficult-to-place candidates. The program was legitimate and properly approved, but necessarily discreet, because public awareness might compromise the validity of behavioral research into unemployment patterns. My documentation had been noticed because it potentially threatened the integrity of ongoing research. Not because I discovered anything inappropriate, but because external scrutiny could alter participant behavior and invalidate months of careful data collection. They appreciated my concern about employment practices, but asked that I discontinue my documentation and avoid sharing information about the research through any channels, including hidden communities where I'd been contributing evidence. In exchange for my cooperation, they were prepared to provide priority placement through agencies that weren't participating in the research program, helping me obtain employment that wouldn't be affected by experimental intervention strategies. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about their approach made me uncomfortable. The level of detail they possessed about my hidden community participation suggested surveillance that went beyond casual monitoring of job search activities. I agreed to discontinue my documentation while privately resolving to research their claims more thoroughly before accepting their explanation. Over the next few weeks, I tried to verify the legitimacy of the research program they described, contacted government departments that might be conducting such studies, searched for published information about authorized employment intervention research. I found nothing that corroborated their explanation. No research projects matching their description. No government connections that could be verified. No official documentation of pilot programs involving recruitment agencies. Either the research was so sensitive that all information was classified, or the explanation had been fabricated to discourage my investigation. I returned to the hidden community to share my concerns about the meeting and seek advice about verifying official research claims. The response was immediate and alarming. Several community members reported similar experiences, investigators or officials contacting them after they documented questionable business practices, providing explanations that couldn't be verified through normal channels. Some contributors had been threatened with legal action for sharing commercially sensitive information about authorized programs. Others had experienced employment difficulties or financial problems after refusing to stop their documentation activities. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to discourage investigation of practices that were operating without proper transparency or accountability. I started researching the business center where I'd attended the meeting, trying to understand who had access to their facilities and whether the people I'd met could be verified through legitimate channels. The center's booking records weren't publicly accessible, but staff mentioned that the room had been reserved by a consultancy firm that used their facilities regularly for for client meetings requiring discretion. I researched the consultancy and found a professional website with generic services and no specific information about current projects or personnel. The sort of deliberately vague presentation that could cover almost any type of consulting work. Further investigation revealed connections between the consultancy and government contracts related to employment services, though the specific nature of their work wasn't clearly documented in public records. The hidden community provided additional context about similar organizations operating in other regions. Consultancies with vague mandates and official connections, often involved in activities that seem to operate outside normal oversight, while maintaining plausible explanations for their work. I was beginning to understand that I'd stumbled across something considerably more complex than recruitment agency fraud. The employment practices I documented were likely part of a broader system designed to manage unemployment as an economic resource, rather than a social problem to be solved. The hidden community had become a way for people to document and share information about these practices, creating alternative information networks for evidence that wasn't being reported through official channels. But it had also made us visible to people who had resources and motivation to monitor our activities and discourage our documentation. Last week, I found something in my flat that confirmed my worst suspicions about how closely I was being monitored. A small device, no larger than a USB drive, tucked behind my laptop, where it wouldn't be noticed during normal use. Professional installation, designed to be invisible unless someone was specifically looking for surveillance equipment. When I researched the device online, I found it was sophisticated monitoring equipment capable of recording internet activity, email communications, and even ambient audio. The sort of surveillance that would document every website visited, every message sent, every conversation conducted near my computer. I'd been under comprehensive observation for months, possibly since I'd first started contributing to the hidden community. Everything I'd researched, everyone I'd communicated with, every piece of evidence I'd gathered had been monitored and recorded. The realization that my investigation had been watched from the beginning made me understand the true scope of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about employment fraud, but about a system capable of monitoring and controlling people who asked inconvenient questions about how economic systems really functioned. I removed the device but kept it in my desk drawer, unsure whether disposing of it would create additional problems, or whether my discovery was being monitored through other methods I hadn't detected. The hidden community continues to operate, though several regular contributors have stopped posting, and some documentation has been removed without explanation. Those of us who remain active share information more carefully, aware that our activities are being monitored by people with considerable resources and few obvious constraints. I'm still unemployed, still searching for legitimate opportunities, still wondering which agencies are genuine and which are part of systems designed to maintain unemployment while profiting from government funding intended to address it. But I'm also aware that my job search activities are being recorded, my internet research is being monitored, and my financial situation is being tracked by people who benefit from keeping certain individuals unemployed indefinitely. The advert was tucked between job listings for cleaners and gardeners, written in the same mundane language you'd expect for any domestic service. Discreet home monitoring while away, professional, reliable, competitive rates, references provided only after service completion. It was that last phrase that felt slightly off. Most services provide references beforehand, not after. But I was desperate to sort out security for my Victorian terrace in Sheffield before my holiday to Greece. Break-ins weren't rare in my area, and period locks wouldn't deter anyone determined enough to try. I called the number that afternoon. The voice was polite and businesslike, explaining temporary monitoring equipment during client absence, cameras and sensors, remote observation, response to issues, considerably cheaper than house sitting. They could assess the property that evening and provide a quote. The consultant, who arrived at 7:30, looked exactly right. Well-dressed, professional tablet, sensible questions about access points and valuables. He walked through systematically, noting camera positions and vulnerable areas, made casual conversation about the house's period features, admired the original cornicing, asked about the basement access. His assessment was thorough without being intrusive. He explained which rooms would need monitoring, how equipment would be positioned to avoid being obvious to potential intruders, what kind of response they could provide if problems were detected. Everything sounded reasonable, professional, legitimate. The quote was fair for 2 weeks of monitoring. They were available for my exact dates. I agreed to installation the day before departure. Payment on completion, as their advert had specified. Installation day arrived with unseasonable rain that made the house feel smaller, more enclosed. 2 technicians worked efficiently through the morning, drilling discrete holes, running thin cables, positioning small cameras in corners where they'd be invisible to casual observation. They tested each component carefully, ensuring clear video quality and reliable transmission. They explained the monitoring process. Continuous but passive observation, immediate contact if anything concerning was detected, coordination with local police if necessary. In case of emergency, they had my mobile number and hotel details, professional, thorough, reassuring. I left for Greece feeling confident that competent people were protecting my property. The holiday was exactly what I'd needed. 2 weeks of sun, decent food, relaxation that comes from knowing responsibilities are handled by professionals. I received 3 routine updates during my absence. Brief texts confirming normal activity, no security concerns, all systems functioning properly. The sort of communication that justified the expense and validated my decision to hire them. When I returned, the house felt exactly as I'd left it. All monitoring equipment had been removed so thoroughly there was no obvious evidence it had ever been installed. A brief report waited on my kitchen table, summarizing 2 weeks of observation with professional efficiency. According to the report, there had been no security incidents, no attempted break-ins, no unusual activity around the property. A few routine visits from postal workers and delivery drivers, but nothing requiring intervention. The service had been invisible, effective, exactly what I'd paid for. I was impressed enough to recommend them to neighbors who'd expressed similar concerns about leaving properties unattended. Mrs. Patterson, from 3 doors down, used them for her Lake District trip in October. Mr. Chen across the street hired them for his business travel in November. The Johnsons at number 47 booked them for their Christmas cruise. All reported the same professional service, the same invisible efficiency, the same peace of mind that comes from knowing your home is being properly monitored. The problem started subtly, about 6 weeks after my return. 2 days after what should have been the end of all monitoring, I noticed the bathroom light was on when I came home from work. I always switched it off, always checked before leaving. Standing in the hallway, I caught a faint smell I couldn't place, like bleach mixed with something metallic, sharp and wrong. It stayed there for hours, stubborn as though it had been worked into the air. I checked the house thoroughly, but found nothing missing, nothing obviously disturbed. Just that persistent feeling that someone else had been moving through my space, touching my belongings, breathing my air. Then the targeted advertising started. Emails about specific cleaning supplies for Victorian properties, repair services for damp issues I'd never mentioned to anyone, security equipment for period features only I would know needed attention, phone calls offering solutions to maintenance problems they couldn't possibly know about. The precision was unsettling. Companies contacting me about the loose floorboard in the back bedroom, the crack in the basement wall I'd been meaning to fix, even the specific brand of paint I'd need to touch up the kitchen skirting. Knowledge that could only come from someone who'd been inside my house, observing details I'd never shared with anyone. Mrs. Patterson mentioned she was having similar experiences. Targeted recommendations since her monitoring service. Companies knowing details about her Victorian conversion that she'd never discussed online. Mr. Chen had received calls about his boiler efficiency and garden drainage, problems he'd been researching privately. The Johnsons were getting quotes for roof repairs and double glazing replacement, work they'd been considering but hadn't mentioned to anyone except each other. All of us using the same monitoring service. All of us feeling like our privacy had been compromised in ways we couldn't articulate or prove. I tried calling their number, generic voicemail promising return calls that never came. Email bounced back as undeliverable. The professional website I'd found originally no longer existed. The company had either ceased operating or made themselves deliberately unreachable once their services were complete. That's when I started wondering what they'd actually monitored during my holiday and whether the surveillance had ended when their equipment was supposedly removed. The question nagged at me for weeks. I'd assumed the monitoring was straightforward security observation. Cameras watching for intruders, sensors detecting unauthorized entry, professional staff responding to genuine emergencies. But the targeted marketing suggested they'd gathered considerably more information than necessary for basic home protection. I researched methods for detecting hidden surveillance equipment, purchased radio frequency detectors, infrared scanners, devices designed to locate concealed cameras and listening devices. Found nothing obvious, but the targeted advertising continued with increasing specificity and accuracy. Companies were contacting me about problems I'd only just discovered myself. A blocked drain in the utility room, condensation issues in the loft, even wear patterns on carpets that would only be visible to someone conducting detailed interior surveys. It was during this research that I stumbled across something that changed my understanding entirely. I was looking into home security options online, trying to find legitimate alternatives to the service I'd used, when a search led me to areas of the internet I'd never encountered before. Hidden services that required special software to access, communities operating outside normal oversight and regulation. One site, reached through several layers of anonymity, hosted what appeared to be live feeds from residential properties, real-time surveillance of people in their own homes, completely unaware they were being observed by strangers online. The interface was professional despite its hidden nature. Multiple video feeds showing different locations, chat functions allowing viewers to communicate, even rating systems for different streams based on content quality and viewer engagement. Most feeds showed empty rooms or routine domestic activity. People cooking, watching television, going about normal daily routines, while cameras documented their every movement. Dozens of properties, hundreds of viewers, a thriving community built around watching strangers live their private lives. I scrolled through available feeds with mounting horror, recognizing the violation these people were experiencing without their knowledge or consent. Then I saw something that made my blood turn to ice water. One feed showed my living room. I couldn't process what I was seeing at first. Cold spread through my chest as I stared at the screen. My coffee mug on the side table where I'd left it an hour ago. Afternoon light falling through windows at exactly the right angle. The book I'd been reading still open on the sofa, reading glasses beside it where I'd placed them before going to make tea. I watched the timestamp update in real time while someone in the chat commented about my choice of evening reading. Another viewer making predictions about what I'd do when I returned from the kitchen. This wasn't archive footage from my holiday monitoring. This was happening now, in real time, while I sat at my laptop in the very room being broadcast to anonymous strangers online. The realization hit me with physical force. The monitoring service hadn't removed all their equipment when I returned from Greece. They'd left cameras running, streaming my daily life to paying audiences who treated my private moments as entertainment. I slammed the laptop shut and sat in darkness, trying to process the violation I discovered. Then I reopened it and forced myself to keep watching, needing to understand the full scope of what was happening. The chat was active with viewers discussing my routine, making observations about my habits, even placing bets on my behavior patterns. They knew when I usually went to bed, what I typically watched on television, how long I spent reading before sleep. Intimate knowledge of my private life gathered through weeks or months of continuous observation. Some comments suggested viewers had been watching since shortly after my return from holiday. Others referenced changes in my routine, expressing disappointment when I'd altered patterns they'd grown accustomed to following. I was living entertainment for strangers who'd been studying my life with the dedication of researchers, analyzing my behavior, predicting my choices, treating my existence as a performance staged for their amusement. Over the next few hours, I searched every room systematically, behind mirrors, inside light fittings, around door frames, anywhere cameras could be concealed. I kept thinking about that smell, the way it had clung to the air like evidence, the bathroom light that had been left on, the subtle signs of intrusion I dismissed as paranoia. I hired a professional security consultant to sweep the property. They found nothing obvious, suggested monitoring might use methods that weren't physically present in the house. Remote access through existing devices, exploitation of smart systems, surveillance through infrastructure I wasn't aware of. But I didn't have smart home technology, and the feeds were showing angles that couldn't be captured through televisions or computers. Someone had installed professional surveillance equipment that was sophisticated enough to avoid detection by standard sweeping procedures. The feeds continued showing perfect coverage of my daily routine from multiple angles, suggesting a comprehensive system rather than occasional monitoring. I started covering mirrors with towels, unplugging every electrical device, even dismantling the smoke alarm and peeling back wallpaper to check for hidden wiring. The feed quality never diminished. Anonymous viewers discussed my increasing paranoia as entertainment, one commenting, "He's taking apart the kitchen radio now, lol," while another typed, "Bet he checks the fridge next. They always do." Complete. Perfect. Every move I made to reclaim privacy was exactly the content they wanted. My desperate attempts to locate surveillance equipment had become part of the show, providing viewers with drama and unpredictability that enhanced their entertainment experience. They were watching me search for them, commenting on my methods, laughing at my futile efforts to regain control of my own home. I checked the other feeds on the site and recognized several properties from my neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson's front room, Mr. Chen's kitchen, even the Johnsons' bedroom where they were sleeping peacefully. while strangers watched and commented on their unconscious movements. All of us who'd used the same monitoring service. All of us now providing ongoing entertainment for audiences who'd paid for permanent access to our private lives. The scope was larger than I'd initially understood. This wasn't just about my house, but about an entire network of residential surveillance disguised as legitimate security services. Professional installation during supposed holiday monitoring, equipment left behind to provide continuous streaming content. I researched the site structure and found hundreds of residential feeds from across the UK. Victorian terraces, modern developments, converted flats, a comprehensive collection of homes where owners had unknowingly become performers in an ongoing reality show. The business model was sophisticated. Customers paid for access to different tiers of content, with premium subscriptions providing high-definition feeds and interactive features. Popular streams generated additional revenue through viewer donations and special requests. My house appeared to be performing well in their metrics. High viewer engagement, consistent audience, positive ratings for content quality and entertainment value. I was a successful performer in a show I'd never auditioned for, generating income for people who'd converted my home into a broadcast studio. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 months after I discovered the feeds. Professional letterhead, quality paper, polite language thanking me for previous use of their monitoring service. An offer for enhanced lifestyle documentation at significantly reduced rates, with detailed information about comprehensive surveillance that would cover all aspects of daily routine and personal habits. But it was the personal touches that made my hands shake. References to my recent home improvement research and interesting reading choices, mentioning specific book titles I'd been browsing online that morning. Casual observations about my evolving sleep patterns and dietary preferences. Knowledge that could only come from continuous, detailed observation. The final paragraph dropped all pretense of professional courtesy, a suggestion that clients who appreciated comprehensive monitoring consistently had positive experiences, while those who failed to understand the benefits often found themselves experiencing unfortunate incidents, equipment malfunctions, security breaches, even accidents around the home. The threat was wrapped in corporate language, but it was unmistakably there. Accept the surveillance as an ongoing service, or risk consequences that could affect my safety, security, and well-being. I never responded to the letter, but the message was clear. I'd become part of their business whether I'd consented to ongoing monitoring or not. The feeds remained active. Anonymous viewers continued discussing my routines, making predictions about my behavior, treating my private life as interactive entertainment. Sometimes I found myself performing for cameras I couldn't locate, wondering if compliance might offer some protection from whatever threats they'd implied. But mostly, I tried to maintain normal routines while knowing that dozens of strangers were watching me eat breakfast, read books, fall asleep in front of the television. The psychological impact was cumulative. Every private moment felt observed, every personal habit subject to analysis by anonymous audiences. I couldn't relax in my own home, couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, judged, discussed by people who knew intimate details of my life, while remaining completely hidden themselves. Last week, I found something on my kitchen counter that made my hands shake. A tiny ceramic house, perfect miniature of my own terrace, positioned exactly where cameras would capture it clearly. Even the small chip in the front step was there. Damage I'd noticed just 3 days ago when the postman stumbled. When I checked the feed, viewers were discussing their housewarming gift, debating whether I understood the message. It wasn't just any figurine. It was my house, recreated in porcelain by people who could enter whenever they chose, study architectural details, reproduce them with perfect accuracy, then leave tokens to prove their complete access and control. They weren't just watching anymore. They were inside, moving through my home while I slept, studying every detail, leaving evidence of their presence for both me and their online audience to discover. The ceramic house sat on my counter for 3 days before I finally moved it. During those 3 days, viewer comments speculated about my psychological state, analyzed my reluctance to disturb their gift, discussed whether my eventual response would meet their expectations for dramatic content. When I finally picked it up, my hands were trembling. The ceramic was warm, as if it had been recently handled. Underneath, someone had carved a tiny message into my kitchen counter. Thank you for the show. My neighbor knocked on my door at 9:30 on a Thursday evening, holding a bottle of wine and wearing the sort of smile that suggested she'd been working up the courage to make this visit for weeks. I was 27 and had been living in the ground floor flat in Exeter for about 6 months, long enough to establish that Claire from upstairs was friendly but not intrusive, the sort of neighbor who'd accept parcels and water plants without expecting lengthy conversations in return. She apologized for the late hour, but explained that she'd been meaning to invite me up for dinner as a proper welcome to the building. Nothing fancy, just a chance to get to know each other better, since we'd be sharing the same address for the foreseeable future. I was working as a freelance translator, mostly doing technical documents for engineering firms, which meant spending most days alone in my flat converting German and French manuals into English that wouldn't confuse anyone trying to operate complex machinery. The isolation was starting to affect me more than I'd expected when I'd chosen freelance work over office employment. Having an actual social interaction that didn't involve explaining why hydraulic systems documentation needed precise terminology felt genuinely appealing. Claire's flat was exactly what you'd expect from someone who worked in marketing for a local arts organization. Tasteful furniture, interesting books, walls covered with exhibition posters from galleries I'd never visited but probably should have. She'd prepared an excellent meal and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about translation work, asking thoughtful questions about the challenges of technical accuracy and whether I missed having colleagues to discuss difficult projects with. About halfway through dinner, she mentioned that she'd been feeling similarly isolated recently, despite working with creative people who were supposedly excellent at maintaining social connections. The conversation shifted to discussing how modern work arrangements were making genuine human interaction increasingly rare, with everyone communicating through digital intermediaries that stripped away the subtleties of face-to-face conversation. She'd been exploring ways to connect with people who shared similar concerns about digital isolation, looking for communities that prioritized authentic communication over the performative social media interactions that had become standard. That's when she mentioned discovering online spaces that weren't part of the mainstream internet, places where people could have genuine discussions without worrying about algorithmic manipulation or corporate data collection. I admitted that I'd heard about hidden parts of the internet, but had never explored them myself, assuming they were either too technical for casual users or focused on activities I wouldn't be interested in participating in. Claire laughed and explained that this was a common misconception. Many hidden communities were actually more accessible and welcoming than mainstream platforms, designed for people who valued privacy and authentic conversation over viral content and commercial advertising. She'd been participating in several discussion groups that focused on topics ranging from philosophy to creative writing, all hosted on networks that required special software, but weren't particularly difficult to access once you understood the basic principles. The communities she'd found were refreshingly different from anything available through normal internet browsing. Thoughtful participants, meaningful discussions, genuine interest in understanding different perspectives rather than winning arguments or gaining followers. She offered to show me how to access these communities if I was curious about experiencing online interaction that felt more like actual conversation than performative social media posting. The demonstration was surprisingly straightforward. Claire had the necessary software already installed on her laptop, and within minutes we were browsing communities that looked and functioned much like regular discussion sites, but felt completely different in terms of content quality and participant behavior. The first few groups she showed me were focused on creative writing and literary criticism. Exactly the sort of intellectual discussion that had been missing from my daily routine since leaving university. Participants shared original work, provided thoughtful feedback, and engaged in sophisticated analysis that would have been impossible to maintain on platforms designed for quick consumption and instant reaction. But as Claire navigated through different communities, I started noticing content that was considerably more concerning than creative writing workshops. Some groups were sharing information that seemed intended to remain private, personal details about public figures, internal communications from businesses and government organizations, even what appeared to be surveillance footage from various locations. Claire explained that these were investigative communities, groups of people who researched topics that weren't being covered adequately by mainstream journalism. Citizen investigators who used their collective skills to uncover information that might otherwise remain hidden. The work they were doing seemed legitimate, if ethically complex, documenting corporate misconduct, investigating political corruption, exposing activities that were being concealed from public scrutiny through official or legal pressure. But some of the content made me uncomfortable. Photographs that appeared to have been taken without subjects' knowledge, personal information that seemed too detailed to have been gathered through public sources, discussions about methods for accessing restricted information. When I expressed concern about the legality of some activities being discussed, Claire assured me that the communities were careful to focus on information that was already accessible through various public sources, just aggregated and analyzed more thoroughly than traditional journalism typically allowed. She showed me how to create accounts and participate in discussions, explaining the etiquette and safety practices that would help me contribute meaningfully while protecting my privacy. Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending increasing amounts of time in these hidden communities, initially drawn by the quality of literary discussions, but gradually becoming interested in the investigative work that some groups were conducting. The research techniques they used were sophisticated, combining traditional journalism methods with technological approaches that allowed them to gather and analyze information more efficiently than individual investigators could manage. I started contributing translation skills to groups that were working with documents in multiple languages, helping them understand materials that might contain important information but weren't accessible to English-only researchers. The work felt meaningful in ways that technical manual translation never had. Instead of helping people operate machinery, I was helping uncover information that might expose wrongdoing or provide evidence of activities that were being deliberately concealed. But I also started noticing that some of the communities Claire had introduced me to were focused on activities that went beyond investigation into what seemed like active harassment of specific individuals. Groups that shared detailed personal information about people they claimed were involved in various forms of misconduct, including private addresses, family connections, employment details, and daily routines that would be impossible to gather without systematic surveillance. Some discussions included suggestions for actions that participants could take to disrupt the lives of these targeted individuals, methods for causing professional problems, techniques for creating financial difficulties, even strategies for psychological harassment that would be difficult to trace or prove. The tone of these discussions was casual and matter-of-fact, as if ruining people's lives was routine problem-solving rather than serious criminal activity. When I raised concerns about these communities with Claire, she explained that they were focused on accountability for people who had used their positions to cause harm, but had avoided consequences through official channels. Sometimes traditional justice systems failed to address serious wrongdoing, she said, and citizen action was necessary to ensure that harmful individuals faced appropriate consequences for their behavior. The targets weren't randomly selected, but carefully researched individuals who had demonstrated patterns of behavior that justified intervention by people who understood the full scope of their activities. She showed me documentation that these communities had compiled about various targets, evidence of corporate fraud, political corruption, abuse of power, and other activities that had been reported to authorities but hadn't resulted in appropriate accountability. The research was impressively thorough, with detailed timelines, cross-reference sources, and analysis that would have met academic standards for investigative research. But the proposed responses to this research were disturbing. Rather than continuing to work through official channels, many participants advocated for direct action that would force targets to experience consequences regardless of legal outcomes. I started researching some of the individuals being targeted by these communities, trying to understand whether the allegations against them were justified and whether the harassment they were experiencing was proportionate to their alleged wrongdoing. What I discovered was deeply troubling. While some targets had indeed been involved in questionable activities, others appeared to have been selected based on incomplete information or unsubstantiated allegations. The communities had created detailed profiles of people who might be entirely innocent, sharing their personal information and encouraging harassment based on research that was sophisticated but not necessarily accurate. Some targets were experiencing severe consequences, job losses, relationship problems, financial difficulties, even safety concerns, based on community decisions that had been made without proper verification of the allegations against them. I tried to raise these concerns within the communities, suggesting that their research standards might need improvement and that some of their targets might not deserve the harassment they were experiencing. The response was immediate and hostile. Participants questioned my commitment to accountability, suggested that I was more concerned with protecting wrongdoers than supporting victims, and accused me of being insufficiently informed about the full scope of the target's alleged activities. Some community members started researching my own background, gathering personal information, and analyzing my online activities to determine whether my objections were legitimate concerns or evidence that I was connected to the people they were targeting. Within days, I found detailed discussions about my personal life, professional activities, and even my friendship with Claire appearing in communities that I'd never participated in. The research about me was thorough and largely accurate, compiled from sources that included information I'd never shared publicly and observations that could only have come from systematic surveillance of my daily routine. They'd gathered enough personal information to create a comprehensive profile that covered my employment history, financial circumstances, social connections, and even private activities that I'd assumed were invisible to outside observation. The tone of discussions about me was analytical rather than immediately threatening, but the implications were clear. If I continued to object to their targeting methods, I could easily become a target myself. Claire visited again the following week. ostensibly to check on how I was adapting to the communities she'd introduced me to. But her questions were more specific than casual social inquiry. She wanted to know which groups I'd been participating in, what kinds of contributions I'd been making, and whether I'd encountered any content that concerned me. When I mentioned my reservations about some of the harassment activities I'd observed, she seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction. She explained that accountability work required difficult decisions about how to respond to people who had caused harm, but avoided consequences through official channels. Sometimes direct action was the only way to ensure that wrongdoers faced appropriate repercussions for their behavior. The communities weren't engaged in random harassment, but in carefully considered interventions designed to protect potential future victims by ensuring that harmful individuals experience consequences that might deter similar behavior. If some innocent people occasionally experience temporary inconvenience as a result of imperfect information, that was unfortunate but necessary collateral damage in the broader effort to create accountability for people whose harmful activities had been ignored by official systems. Her explanation sounded reasonable in principle, but didn't address my concerns about the accuracy of their research or the proportionality of their responses. More troubling was her casual mention of my own research activities, including details about my investigation into community targeting methods that I hadn't shared with anyone. She knew what I'd been researching, which communities I'd been questioning, and even which specific targets I'd been investigating independently. Either she had access to my private online activities, or the communities we'd been participating in were monitoring their members more closely than I'd realized. Over the next few days, I started experiencing technical problems that interfered with my ability to access both the hidden communities and regular internet services. Connection issues prevented me from participating in discussions, email problems disrupted my professional translation work, and even basic web browsing became unreliable enough to affect my ability to research the targeting concerns I'd been investigating. The problems were sophisticated enough to suggest deliberate interference rather than routine technical difficulties, but subtle enough that reporting them to internet service providers wouldn't result in meaningful investigation. I realized that questioning the targeting methods of communities that specialized in harassment had made me a problem that needed to be managed through exactly the sort of systematic interference they used against their other targets. My concerns about innocent people being harassed had led to me being harassed, using techniques that were designed to disrupt my life, while remaining difficult to prove or address through official channels. I stopped participating in the hidden communities entirely, hoping that withdrawal would end the technical problems and reduce my visibility to groups that had demonstrated their willingness to target people who questioned their methods. But the interference continued, expanding from internet connectivity to other aspects of my daily life. Professional translation projects began experiencing problems that seemed to originate from my end, but weren't caused by anything I'd done wrong. Client communications became unreliable, file transfers failed at crucial moments, and technical issues affected my ability to meet deadlines. My income started declining as clients lost confidence in my reliability, attributing professional problems to my own incompetence rather than systematic sabotage by people who wanted to punish me for asking inconvenient questions. The harassment was sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to create maximum disruption while maintaining plausible deniability about its source and intentional nature. Last week, I found something that confirmed my worst suspicions about how closely my activities had been monitored from the beginning. A printed summary of my online research, left in my mailbox where I'd be certain to find it. The document contained detailed analysis of my investigation into community targeting methods, including screenshots of private browsing sessions and transcripts of conversations I'd had with Claire. The research about me was as thorough as the profiles they'd created for their other targets, compiled with the same systematic approach and presented with the same analytical detachment. But attached to the summary was a handwritten note that made their position clear. Accountability works both ways. They wanted me to understand that questioning their methods had made me subject to the same treatment they provided to their other targets, and that continued investigation would result in escalated harassment, designed to make my concerns about their activities seem insignificant compared to my own problems. The hidden communities continue to operate, the targeting continues to expand, and people continue to experience systematic harassment disguised as accountability for alleged wrongdoing that may or may not be accurately documented. I still do translation work when technical problems allow it, still live in the same building as Claire, who continues to smile when we pass in the hallway, still wonder how many other people have been introduced to communities that turn legitimate concerns about justice into systematic harassment of anyone who asks uncomfortable questions about their methods. But I'm also aware that my daily routine is being monitored, my professional activities are being sabotaged, and my personal information is being shared among people who've made questioning their targeting methods into justification for making me a target myself. I've struggled with my weight since I was a teenager, trying every diet and exercise program that promised lasting results. Growing up in Norwich with a family that showed love through food, I learned early that eating was about much more than nutrition. By the time I started university in Cambridge, I was carrying enough extra weight to affect my confidence and health, but not enough to qualify for NHS support. The campus gym was intimidating and expensive. Most diet programs were designed for people with more money than students typically had, and the stress of studying often made my eating habits worse rather than better. I tried various online communities and apps, but most were either full of people selling supplements or so focused on extreme restrictions that they felt impossible to maintain. That's when I found a community called Wellness Transformation that claimed to offer personalized support for people who had struggled with traditional weight loss methods. Their approach emphasized gradual lifestyle changes rather than dramatic restrictions, with individual meal plans and regular check-ins with qualified nutrition advisors. The registration process was thorough, including detailed questionnaires about my medical history, current eating habits, exercise routine, and previous diet experiences. They also requested information about my living situation, daily schedule, and access to different types of food in my area. They explained that successful weight loss required understanding the complete context of someone's life, including social and environmental factors that might affect their ability to maintain healthy habits. The comprehensive assessment would allow them to create a program that was realistic and sustainable for my specific circumstances. Within a week, I received a personalized meal plan with detailed shopping lists, preparation instructions, and explanations of how each element contributed to healthy weight loss. The plan was more complex than I'd expected, including specific brands of ingredients, precise portion measurements, and timing requirements for meals and snacks. But the recommendations seemed well researched, and the advisor assigned to my case was knowledgeable about nutrition science and weight management. The plan avoided extreme restrictions and included foods I actually enjoyed, making it feel sustainable rather than punitive. I started following the meal plan carefully, tracking my progress through the community's app and participating in regular check-ins with my advisor. The initial results were encouraging, steady weight loss without the hunger and fatigue that had sabotaged previous diet attempts. But after a few weeks, I began experiencing symptoms that seemed unrelated to normal weight loss. Persistent headaches, difficulty concentrating, and occasional dizziness that made it hard to focus during lectures. When I mentioned these issues to my advisor, they assured me that temporary discomfort was normal as my body adjusted to healthier eating patterns. They recommended specific supplements that were supposed to help with the transition period, explaining that many people experience similar symptoms when changing from processed foods to natural ingredients. The supplements were available through the community's website at reasonable prices. The symptoms persisted despite taking the recommended supplements, and I started feeling worse rather than better as I continued following the meal plan. The weight loss was continuing, but I was experiencing fatigue and mood changes that seemed excessive for someone who was supposedly becoming healthier. When I tried to research the specific ingredients and supplements recommended in my meal plan, I found limited information about some of the products. Several supplements contained compounds I couldn't identify, and some of the specialized food items were only available through suppliers connected to wellness transformation. I started paying closer attention to the other members of the community, looking for people who might be experiencing similar symptoms or had concerns about the meal plans they'd been given. What I found was troubling. Many community members reported experiencing health problems that seemed to worsen the longer they followed their personalized plans. Digestive issues, sleep problems, anxiety, and physical symptoms that were dismissed by advisors as normal parts of the weight loss process. More concerning was that members who questioned the safety of their meal plans or tried to modify the recommendations were often removed from the community entirely. The advisors claimed that deviation from prescribed plans would compromise results and that people who couldn't commit to following instructions weren't suitable for the program. I tried to research wellness transformation more thoroughly and found that while they claimed to employ qualified nutritionists and medical professionals, there was minimal verifiable information about their staff credentials or regulatory oversight of their programs. The supplements they recommended weren't approved by standard health authorities, and some contained ingredients that had been associated with adverse health effects in medical literature. The meal plan seemed designed to create nutritional deficiencies rather than promote genuine wellness. I realized I might be participating in some form of medical experiment or systematic poisoning disguised as a weight loss program. When I tried to contact other members directly to discuss our experiences, I found that the community's messaging system was heavily monitored and restricted. Members couldn't communicate privately, and discussions about health concerns or program modifications were quickly deleted or redirected. The isolation was deliberate, preventing participants from comparing experiences or recognizing patterns that might reveal the true purpose of the meal plans. I decided to stop following my meal plan and tried to withdraw from the program entirely. But the community's response was immediate and concerning. My advisor contacted me within hours, expressing worry about my decision and explaining that sudden dietary changes could be dangerous. After following their program for several weeks, they claimed that my body had adapted to their nutritional approach and that returning to previous eating habits without proper transition could cause serious health problems. They offered to modify my plan rather than discontinue it entirely, emphasizing the medical risks of abandoning their program abruptly. But they also began demonstrating knowledge about my daily routine and activities that they couldn't have obtained through the community's website. References to my university schedule, where I lived, even details about my family that I'd never shared during registration. Someone had been researching my background and monitoring my activities outside the weight loss program. I tried to research other people who had withdrawn from wellness transformation, looking for information about whether they'd experienced pressure to continue or health problems after stopping their meal plans. What I found was that most former participants seemed to have disappeared from any online discussion of weight loss or health topics. No reviews of the program, no discussions of their experiences, no presence in other diet and wellness communities. Either they'd been convinced to stay quiet about their experiences, or something had happened to prevent them from sharing information about what they'd discovered. I started documenting everything I could about the program, the specific ingredients in meal plans, the supplements being recommended, the health symptoms reported by participants, and the monitoring and pressure tactics used to maintain compliance. This investigation revealed that Wellness Transformation was probably conducting systematic experiments on people under the guise of weight loss support. The personalized meal plans were designed to test the effects of various compounds and nutritional deficiencies on human subjects who had unknowingly consented to participate in medical research. The detailed personal information collected during registration allowed them to select participants who were isolated, financially vulnerable, or dealing with health and self-esteem issues that made them unlikely to question adverse effects or seek external medical attention. But gathering evidence of the experimental program put me at risk of being identified as someone who was investigating their activities. The monitoring they demonstrated suggested they were tracking participants' online behavior and real-world activities. If they realized I was documenting their methods and health effects, they might decide I posed a security risk that needed to be managed through more direct intervention. Meanwhile, the symptoms I'd experienced while following their meal plan were getting worse rather than better, even after stopping their recommended diet. Some of the compounds I'd consumed might have long-term effects that would continue affecting my health regardless of dietary changes. I tried to get medical attention for the symptoms I'd been experiencing, but explaining the situation to doctors was complicated. Admitting that I'd been following an unregulated online diet plan made me appear careless about my health, and the symptoms were vague enough that they could be attributed to stress, poor sleep, or other common student health problems. Most medical professionals weren't familiar with Wellness Transformation or the specific supplements I'd been taking, making it difficult to get appropriate treatment for whatever physiological changes had been caused by their experimental meal plans. I was trapped between needing medical help for symptoms caused by participating in their program and being unable to prove the connection between my health problems and their experimental treatments. When I tried to contact regulatory authorities about Wellness Transformation's activities, I found that oversight of online nutrition programs was limited and unclear. They operated in legal grey areas that made it difficult to prosecute even obvious medical experiments conducted without proper consent or safety protocols. The community was still operating when I last checked, continuing to recruit new participants for their experimental meal plans while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate weight loss support service. My advisor was probably still conducting regular check-ins with new victims, monitoring their symptoms and adjusting their experimental treatments based on observed health effects. And somewhere in hidden databases, detailed records were being maintained about the physiological responses of hundreds of people who had unknowingly participated in medical experiments that violated every principle of informed consent and participant safety. The weight loss program I'd thought would help me become healthier had instead made me a test subject in systematic experiments that were designed to study the effects of various compounds on human physiology. But the most disturbing aspect was realizing how many other people were probably participating in similar programs without understanding the true nature of what they'd signed up for. Online communities promising health improvements, fitness programs, nutrition support, and medical guidance were probably being used as recruitment tools for experimental research that couldn't be conducted through legitimate medical institutions. People seeking help with legitimate health concerns were being systematically exploited by researchers who used their vulnerabilities and trust to conduct experiments that would be prohibited in any ethical medical setting. The symptoms I'd experienced were probably mild compared to what other participants might be enduring in programs designed to test more dangerous compounds or more extreme physiological interventions. 2 weeks after stopping contact with Wellness Transformation entirely, I received a package at my university address containing supplements I'd never ordered, along with a note explaining that my advisor was concerned about my health and wanted to ensure I had access to treatments that would help with the withdrawal symptoms I was probably experiencing. I'm not sure why I'm writing this down. Maybe because saying it out loud to anyone feels impossible, or maybe because I need to see it all laid out in front of me to understand what actually happened. Either way, I keep thinking that if I don't tell someone, even if it's just words on a screen, then I'm going to lose my mind trying to make sense of it alone. This started about 14 months ago, during a particularly bleak period in my life. I was living in Leeds, working as a pharmacy assistant, which sounds more important than it actually was. Mostly, I just counted tablets and dealt with people collecting prescriptions. The pay was terrible. I'd recently ended a long-term relationship, and I was spending most of my free time alone in my bedsit feeling sorry for myself. Not a great place to be mentally, but not unusual either. Plenty of people go through rough patches. One evening, after a particularly tedious shift, where the automated system had gone down and we'd had to process everything manually, I came home and did what I usually did. Made some toast, opened my laptop, and started browsing mindlessly. I'd been reading about internet privacy, data collection, that sort of thing. The kind of articles that make you realize how much of your personal information is floating around out there. It's unsettling when you really think about it. That led me down a rabbit hole about anonymity online, which eventually led to articles about the dark web. I'd heard of it, obviously. Everyone has. But I'd always assumed it was either inaccessible to ordinary people or exclusively used for illegal purposes. The articles I read suggested otherwise. Apparently, a lot of it was just people wanting privacy. Activists in repressive countries, journalists protecting their sources, whistleblowers. Normal people who didn't want corporations tracking their every click. Getting access turned out to be surprisingly straightforward. I'm not particularly technical, but I managed it in maybe 15 minutes. And suddenly, there I was, browsing this entirely different version of the internet. Most of it was disappointing, honestly. Broken links, sites that wouldn't load, pages that looked like they'd been designed in 1995. I spent an hour clicking around, not finding anything particularly interesting or shocking. Then I found something called the Volunteer Program. It was linked from one of those directory sites that list various dark web services. The description was minimal. Connect with people who need help. Make a real difference. There was a simple web address underneath. When I clicked through, the page that loaded was plain but professional looking. White background, black text, a logo at the top showing two hands clasped together. The homepage explained what the program was about. Essentially, it was a platform connecting volunteers with people who needed assistance but couldn't access traditional help channels. People in difficult situations. People who couldn't go to authorities or official organizations for various reasons. The site emphasized that everything was confidential and anonymous, designed to protect both volunteers and the people seeking help. It all sounded quite noble, actually. There was a section explaining the kinds of help people might need. Someone to talk to during a crisis, assistance locating resources, help navigating difficult personal situations, support for people escaping dangerous circumstances. The site stressed that volunteers were never asked to do anything illegal or put themselves at risk. It was purely about offering guidance, emotional support, and practical advice to people who had nowhere else to turn. There was a button at the bottom, register as a volunteer. I clicked it without thinking too much about it. The form that appeared asked for basic information: age, general location, languages spoken, areas where I might be able to help. There were options to select: emotional support, practical advice, resource guidance, local knowledge. I ticked a few boxes. Emotional support seemed doable. I could listen to people. And local knowledge, since I'd lived in Leeds for several years and knew the area reasonably well. The form asked for an anonymous contact method. I created a temporary email address and submitted the form. The confirmation page said someone would review my application and be in touch within a few days if I was accepted. I closed the browser and didn't think much more about it. It had been a momentary impulse, filling out a form on a random website. I didn't really expect anything to come of it. 4 days later, I checked the temporary email account and found a message waiting. The subject line said, "Volunteer application approved." The message welcomed me to the program and explained how it worked. When someone needed help, they would submit a request through the platform describing their situation. The system would match them with appropriate volunteers based on location and expertise. If I was selected for a request, I'd receive an email with details and could choose whether to accept or decline. Everything was anonymous. I'd never know the real identity of the person I was helping, and they'd never know mine. It seemed straightforward enough. At the end of the email was a link to the volunteer dashboard where I could view any requests assigned to me. I clicked through. The dashboard was empty except for a welcome message and some basic statistics. Apparently, there were around 300 active volunteers and roughly twice that many people seeking help at any given time. The site had been running for several years and had facilitated thousands of successful connections. I left it at that. Checked the dashboard every few days, but there were never any requests assigned to me. I started to forget about it. Then, about 3 weeks after I'd registered, an email arrived. The subject line said, "New request assigned, action required." The message explained that someone in the Leeds area had submitted a request for help, and I'd been matched based on my location and indicated areas of support. The person's situation was described briefly. They were trying to leave a difficult living arrangement, but didn't have access to traditional support services. They needed advice about local resources and someone to talk to who understood the area. There was a link to a secure messaging system where I could communicate with them if I chose to accept the request. The email stressed that I could decline at any time, for any reason, with no explanation required. I clicked through to the messaging system. There was one message waiting, sent from an anonymous account identified only as Request 247. The message was longer than I'd expected. It explained that the person was living with a family member who had become increasingly controlling and aggressive. They wanted to move out, but didn't have much money or anywhere to go. They couldn't go to the council or social services because of complicated family circumstances they didn't want to explain. They just needed someone to talk to who knew Leeds, who might be able to suggest places to stay or organizations that could help without asking too many questions. The tone was desperate, but not melodramatic. Just someone in a bad situation, looking for practical help. I wrote back, said I was sorry they were going through this, and that I tried to help however I could. I asked a few questions about what kind of accommodation they were looking for and whether they had any income. Basic things that would help me point them in the right direction. The response came within a few hours. They answered my questions, provided more details about their situation. They couldn't afford much rent. They needed somewhere short-term, just until they could get themselves sorted. They'd been looking at rooms in shared houses, but most required deposits they didn't have. Over the next few days, we exchanged several messages. I suggested a few hostels and shelters I knew about. Gave them information about local charities that help people in housing crises. I looked up details about housing benefit and how to apply. I tried to be helpful without being pushy or overwhelming. They seemed grateful. Said I was the first person who'd actually listened and tried to help, rather than just telling them what they should do. That felt good, honestly. I was going through my own rough time, feeling fairly useless, and here was something I could actually do that made a difference. After about a week of messages back and forth, they said they'd found a room. Someone was letting them stay temporarily while they sorted out something more permanent. They thanked me repeatedly, said they couldn't have managed without the information I provided. I felt genuinely pleased. It was a small thing really, just answering some questions and pointing someone toward resources, but it had helped. They were safe, or safer at least, and I'd played a small part in that. The messaging system showed the request as completed. A few days later, I received an email from the volunteer program thanking me for my assistance and asking if I'd be willing to accept future requests. I said yes. The second request came about 2 weeks later. Different person, different situation. Someone who was being harassed by an ex-partner and didn't want to involve the police. They needed advice about staying safe, about what to do if the harassment escalated. I provided what information I could, suggested some local organizations that specialized in domestic abuse support, even though they insisted it hadn't reached that level yet. That one resolved fairly quickly too. They said the harassment had stopped after they'd followed some of the safety advice I'd given them. The third request arrived a month after that. This time, it was someone who needed help finding a specific type of support service in Leeds, something to do with mental health. Though they were vague about the details, I did some research, found a few options, passed the information along. They seemed satisfied. I started to feel like I was actually good at this, like I'd found something worthwhile to do with my evenings beyond sitting alone, feeling miserable. The requests kept coming, maybe one every couple of weeks. All different situations, all different people, but all following roughly the same pattern. Someone in trouble, needing local knowledge or a sympathetic ear, and me providing what help I could. Then I got a request that felt different from the start. The initial message was brief and oddly formal. It said the person needed help with what they called a sensitive observation matter. They needed someone in Leeds to visit a specific location and report back on what they saw. Nothing illegal, they stressed. They just needed an independent observer to confirm some information for them. I wrote back asking for more details. What location? What kind of information? The response came quickly. They provided an address in Headingley, not far from where I lived, a residential street. They said they needed someone to go to that address at a specific time, observe the property for maybe half an hour, and report back on any activity they saw. Were the lights on? Were there cars in the driveway? Did anyone come or go? I asked why they needed this information. The response was vague. They said they were trying to verify someone's living situation for personal reasons, but couldn't visit the location themselves. They assured me it wasn't anything sinister, just a matter of confirming some details. It felt odd, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe it was someone checking up on a property they owned, or trying to find out if a relative was actually living where they claimed to be. There were plenty of innocent explanations. I agreed to do it. The address was only a 10-minute walk from my flat. I could go one evening after work, spend half an hour sitting on a bench or walking around the area, see what I saw, and report back. Simple enough. I went the following evening, around 7 o'clock. The address was a terraced house on a quiet street. Lights were on inside. There was a car in the driveway, a dark blue Vauxhall. I walked past a few times casually, like I was just someone out for an evening stroll. The curtains were drawn, but I could see movement through them occasionally. Someone was definitely home. After about 40 minutes, I left and went home. Sent a message through the system describing what I'd seen. Lights on, car present, signs of occupancy. The response came within minutes. They thanked me and asked if I'd be willing to do the same thing again in a few days, at a different time. They wanted to establish a pattern. That's when I should have said no. But I didn't. I'd already done it once, and nothing bad had happened. It was just observation, just reporting factual information. So I agreed. I went back 3 more times over the following week. Different times of day, morning, afternoon, evening. Each time I sent back a brief report. Car present or not present. Lights on or off. People coming or going. Basic observations. After the 4th visit, they said they had everything they needed and thanked me for my help. The request was marked as completed. The next request came a week later. Different person, but similar task. Another address, this time in Kirkstall. Same basic assignment. Observe and report. I did it without questioning. Then another request. Another address. Another observation. I started to realize that most of my requests now were these observation tasks. The other kind, the ones where people needed emotional support or practical advice, had mostly stopped coming. Now it was almost exclusively these surveillance requests. I should have stopped accepting them, but by that point, I'd done maybe 10 or 12 of them, and nothing bad had ever come of it. Nobody had ever confronted me. The police had never shown up. As far as I could tell, I was just collecting information that could have been gathered by anyone walking down a public street. Then I got a request that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The address they gave me was on my own street, 4 doors down from my building. The message said they needed the usual information: observation of the property, activity reports, times when people were present or absent. But it was so close to where I lived. I walked past that house every day. The person making the request would have known that when they assigned it to me. They would have known my general location from my volunteer profile. I wrote back asking why they needed this information. The response was the same vague explanation I'd received before. Personal verification, nothing illegal, just needed an independent observer. I almost declined, but I'd accepted so many of these requests already. What was one more? And it was on my own street. I didn't even need to go out of my way. So I did it. Watched the house for a few days, sent back my reports. The request was completed without incident, but something about it stayed with me. Made me think about all the other observations I'd done, all those addresses, all those reports about when people were home and when they weren't, about their routines and patterns. I went back through my message history, counted up all the observation requests I'd completed. There were more than 20 different addresses across Leeds, 20 different properties I'd surveilled and reported on. I started wondering what the information was being used for. Personal verification, they'd always said. But verification of what? And why did it require multiple observations at different times? Why did it need to be done anonymously through a dark web platform, rather than through any official channel? I tried to tell myself it was fine, that I was overthinking it, that there were legitimate reasons someone might need this kind of information. But the unease wouldn't go away. I stopped accepting observation requests. When they came through, I declined them without explanation. For a while, that seemed to work. I'd get the occasional request, decline it, and nothing would happen. Then I started noticing things, small things at first. My post seemed to arrive later than usual, like someone was checking it before it reached my door. I'd find my bin moved slightly, as though someone had been looking through it. Once, I came home to find my front door unlocked, even though I was certain I'd locked it that morning. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of everything was getting to me, that there were innocent explanations for all of it. Then I checked my volunteer dashboard and saw something that made my blood run cold. My profile had been updated. There was a new section I'd never seen before. Services provided. It listed all the observation requests I'd completed. But not just the addresses. It included photographs of the houses I'd watched, of the streets, of the cars in driveways, of people entering and leaving properties. I hadn't taken any photographs. I'd just observed and reported. But someone else had. Someone had been following me, documenting my surveillance work, taking pictures while I stood there watching houses. And those photographs were now attached to my profile, visible to anyone using the platform. I tried to delete my account. The option wasn't available anymore. I sent a message to the platform administrators demanding they remove my profile. No response came. I stopped checking the dashboard, stopped looking at the messages, but the emails kept coming. New requests being assigned, observation tasks, all in Leeds, all near my home. Then the photographs started appearing in my post, printed out and slipped into my letterbox. Pictures of me standing on various streets, watching various houses. Pictures I hadn't known were being taken. Each one had a date and timestamp. Each one showed me doing exactly what I'd been asked to do. There was never a note with them. Never any explanation, just the photographs. I went to the police, told them someone was following me, taking pictures of me. They asked if I knew who it was or why. I said no. I couldn't tell them about the volunteer program or the observation requests. How could I explain that without implicating myself in something that sounded, in hindsight, very much like stalking? They said they'd keep a record of my report, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They suggested I be vigilant, maybe install a camera outside my flat. I couldn't afford a camera. I could barely afford rent. The photographs kept coming, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. Always pictures of me doing observation work. Always stamped with dates and times that proved exactly when and where I'd been. Then one arrived that was different. It showed me walking home from work, not doing any observation task, just walking down my usual route. The date stamp was from the previous day. They were still following me, still documenting my movements, even though I'd stopped accepting requests. I checked the dashboard one more time. My profile now listed me as temporarily unavailable, but still showed all the completed requests, all the photographs. And there was a new section, current location tracking. Underneath was a map, showing my movements over the past few weeks, my route to work, the shops I visited, the pub where I occasionally met friends, all of it plotted out in detail. I don't know how they were tracking me. My phone, probably. Or maybe they were just following me physically. Maybe it was both. I moved out of my bedsit 2 weeks later, found a new place in a different part of Leeds, didn't tell anyone where I was going except my employer, changed my phone number, deleted all my email accounts, and started fresh. For a few months, everything seemed fine. No more photographs, no more strange incidents. I started to relax, to think maybe I'd managed to escape it. Then a new request appeared. I don't know how it found me because I deleted everything, but somehow it did. An email to my new address from the volunteer program, subject line, outstanding request, urgent. The message said I had one final observation task to complete, an address in my new neighborhood, a property 3 streets away from where I now lived. They'd found me again. I haven't accepted the request, but I haven't declined it either. It just sits there in my inbox, waiting. And every few days, another email arrives. A reminder that the request is still pending, that I'm expected to complete it. I don't know what happens if I refuse. I don't know if they'll escalate, if more photographs will arrive, if they'll do something worse. I've started seeing the same people around my new neighborhood, different people than before, but they're always there, standing on corners, sitting in parked cars, looking at their phones. Maybe they're just ordinary people going about their business. Maybe I'm paranoid now, seeing threats everywhere. Or maybe they're volunteers too. Maybe the whole thing works like this. You help them with one thing, then another, until you've helped so much that you can't stop, until they have so much information about you, so many photographs, so much documentation of your activities, that refusing becomes impossible. I don't go out much anymore. Work and back, that's it. I keep my curtains drawn. I check my post immediately when it arrives. I've covered the camera on my laptop with tape. The request is still sitting in my inbox, still waiting. And I know that eventually I'm going to have to make a decision. Accept it and hope that completing one more task will finally be enough. Or refuse it and find out what they do to volunteers who stop cooperating. Either way, I don't think this ends well for me. I was stupid, naive. I thought I was helping people. I thought I was doing something good. But I wasn't helping anyone. I was working for them, gathering intelligence, conducting surveillance, and now I'm trapped in it with no clear way out. So that's why I'm writing this down. Because if something happens to me, if I disappear or if something worse occurs, at least there will be some record of how it started. Some explanation of why a pharmacy assistant from Leeds ended up involved in whatever this actually is. I wanted to help people. That's all it was supposed to be. But I've learned something these past few months. When someone offers you the chance to help anonymously, with no questions asked and no accountability, you should ask yourself who's really being helped. And more importantly, who's being used. I've always been interested in how people think and make choices, which is probably why I ended up studying psychology at university. The human mind fascinates me. Why some people are naturally optimistic while others see problems everywhere. How our backgrounds shape the way we interpret information. What makes someone choose one path over another when faced with difficult decisions. That curiosity made me a natural participant for research studies. Most psychology departments rely on students volunteering for experiments, and I genuinely enjoyed contributing to research while earning a few pounds for my time. Nothing dramatic, just the sort of studies that help academics understand cognitive processes and social behavior. Most university research was straightforward. Memory tests, personality questionnaires, reaction time measurements. but the studies that paid the best were usually more complex, often involving online platforms where participants could complete tasks at their own pace, rather than coming into labs at specific times. That's how I found the Decision Analysis Research Project, which claimed to be a collaboration between several universities studying how people make choices in complex scenarios. They were looking for participants to evaluate hypothetical situations and explain their reasoning, contributing to research about moral decision-making and risk assessment. The initial screening process was more detailed than typical university studies. Beyond basic demographic information, they wanted to know about my family background, personal relationships, academic interests, and even details about my daily routine and living situation. They explained that understanding participants' context was crucial for interpreting their decision-making patterns. Someone's choices about hypothetical scenarios would be influenced by their real-world experiences, social connections, and current circumstances. The study itself involved regular online sessions where I'd be presented with scenarios and asked to choose between different options, then explain my reasoning in detail. The situation started simple: ethical dilemmas about lying to spare someone's feelings, resource allocation problems, conflicts between personal benefit and social responsibility. The scenarios were thoughtfully constructed, and the debriefing questions were insightful. I could see how my responses would contribute to understanding the psychological factors that influence moral reasoning and decision-making under pressure. But gradually, the scenarios became more personal and disturbing. Instead of abstract ethical dilemmas, I started receiving scenarios that seemed specifically tailored to my circumstances. Situations involving university students in Durham, people with my academic background, even scenarios that included details about the specific area where I lived. When I mentioned this to the research coordinator, they explained that personalized scenarios produced more authentic responses than generic situations. People made different choices when they could relate to the context and characters involved. The scenarios also became more extreme. Instead of minor ethical conflicts, I was being asked to evaluate situations involving serious crimes, violence, and harm to innocent people. The options I could choose between were increasingly disturbing, often requiring me to select which terrible outcome was least problematic. Some scenarios included detailed descriptions of violence or illegal activities that seemed unnecessary for research about decision-making. Others asked me to role-play perspectives that made me uncomfortable, considering situations from the viewpoint of criminals, predators, or people planning to harm others. When I questioned whether these extreme scenarios were appropriate for academic research, the coordinator emphasized the importance of understanding how people reason about difficult moral choices. Real-world decision-making often involved choosing between unpleasant alternatives, and research needed to reflect that complexity. But I started noticing that the scenarios included information that seemed to go beyond what would be necessary for psychology research. Some situations involved specific methods for committing crimes, detailed descriptions of how to avoid detection by law enforcement, even practical advice about acquiring illegal items or accessing restricted locations. The scenarios read more like instruction manuals than research materials. Other scenarios asked me to evaluate strategies for manipulating or coercing other people, with detailed psychological techniques that seemed designed to teach effective manipulation, rather than study moral reasoning about interpersonal influence. I tried to research the Decision Analysis Research Project more thoroughly, looking for information about the universities involved and the academic credentials of the research team. What I found was concerning. While the project claimed to be affiliated with several prestigious institutions, There was no verifiable information about the specific researchers involved or peer-reviewed publications resulting from their work. The registration details were vague, the methodology descriptions were minimal, and there was no evidence that the research had been approved by ethics committees that would normally oversee studies involving potentially disturbing psychological content. I started suspecting that the research project wasn't legitimate academic work at all, but some form of recruitment or training program disguised as university research. The scenarios I was evaluating seemed designed to normalize thinking about criminal activities and to test my willingness to consider increasingly extreme options when presented as hypothetical choices. But the personal information collected during registration meant that my responses were being associated with detailed knowledge of my background, circumstances, and psychological profile. Someone was building a comprehensive assessment of my moral boundaries, decision-making patterns, and susceptibility to various forms of influence or manipulation. When I tried to withdraw from the study, the coordinator's response was immediate and concerning. They expressed disappointment that I was abandoning important research and emphasized my commitment to completing the full study protocol. They also offered substantial bonus payments for continuing participation and suggested that withdrawing would disappoint the academic supervisors, who had specifically requested my continued involvement based on the quality of my previous responses. The pressure to continue felt excessive for volunteer research participation. It seemed more like concern about losing control over someone who had provided valuable information or demonstrated useful capabilities. I tried to research other participants in the decision analysis research project, hoping to understand whether they'd had similar experiences with increasingly disturbing scenarios and pressure to continue participation. But the project's privacy policies prevented direct contact between participants, and online searches revealed no discussions or reviews of the research from people who had completed the study. Either participants were maintaining strict confidentiality about their involvement, or something was preventing them from sharing information about their experiences. I decided to document the scenarios I'd been given and the personal information that had been collected, building evidence of what appeared to be a systematic assessment program targeting university students. This documentation revealed patterns that suggested the research project was actually a recruitment tool for identifying people who might be suitable for various types of criminal activity. The scenarios were designed to test participants' moral flexibility, willingness to consider illegal options, and ability to rationalize harmful choices when presented with appropriate justifications. The personal information collected would allow recruiters to identify participants who were financially vulnerable, socially isolated, or dealing with circumstances that might make them susceptible to offers of illegal employment. But the most disturbing possibility was that successful participants were being gradually conditioned to accept increasingly extreme scenarios as normal decision-making challenges. The study might be a systematic desensitization program designed to prepare people for actual criminal activities by normalizing violence and illegal behavior through repeated exposure in hypothetical contexts. When I stopped responding to scenarios and ignored follow-up communications, the coordinator began contacting me through other channels. Messages to my university email account, contact through social media platforms I'd never shared with the research project, even phone calls to numbers I was certain I hadn't provided during registration. They claimed concern about my well-being and offered support for any problems that might be preventing me from completing the research. But their access to my personal contact information suggested much more comprehensive background research than would be normal for academic studies. Someone had been systematically investigating my online presence and personal circumstances, gathering information that could be used for harassment or intimidation, if I created problems for their operation. The scenarios I'd been asked to evaluate started appearing in other contexts. News reports about crimes that matched the methods and approaches I'd been asked to consider, with enough similarity to suggest that the research scenarios weren't hypothetical at all. Someone was using the decision-making study to test real criminal plans against the moral reasoning and risk assessment capabilities of potential accomplices. The participants weren't contributing to academic research about ethics and psychology. We were unknowingly providing consultation services for people planning actual crimes. Our detailed responses to scenarios were being used to refine criminal strategies, identify potential problems with illegal plans, and select people who might be willing to participate in the activities we'd been asked to evaluate. I realized that my participation in the study had probably contributed to actual crimes against innocent people, with my moral reasoning and decision-making analysis being used to improve the effectiveness of criminal operations. But reporting what I discovered would require admitting that I'd voluntarily participated in evaluating scenarios involving serious crimes, potentially making me appear complicit in planning illegal activities. The detailed personal information collected during the study also made me vulnerable to retaliation if the people running the operation decided I posed a security risk to their continued activities. Meanwhile, the recruitment program was probably continuing to target other students through fake research projects, gradually conditioning new participants to accept criminal scenarios as normal academic exercises while building detailed profiles of their moral flexibility and personal vulnerabilities. The decision analysis research project was still advertising for participants when I last checked, continuing to recruit psychology students who were interested in contributing to research about human decision-making. My former coordinator was probably still presenting increasingly disturbing scenarios to new participants, testing their boundaries and gathering information that could be used to involve them in actual criminal activities. And somewhere in hidden databases, detailed psychological profiles were being maintained about hundreds of students who had unknowingly provided comprehensive assessments of their moral reasoning, criminal potential, and susceptibility to various forms of manipulation and coercion. The research study I'd thought would contribute to understanding human psychology had instead made me an unwitting consultant for criminal operations that exploited academic curiosity to recruit accomplices and refine illegal strategies. But the most disturbing realization was that legitimate university research was probably being infiltrated by similar recruitment programs, making it impossible for students to distinguish between genuine academic studies and criminal assessment tools. People seeking to contribute to psychological research were being systematically evaluated for their potential usefulness in illegal activities, with their trust in academic institutions being exploited to facilitate serious crimes against innocent victims. 3 weeks after I'd stopped all contact with the Decision Analysis Research Project, I received an email claiming to be from the university's ethics committee, asking me to participate in a follow-up study about my research experiences and any concerns I might have about the psychological impact of participating in decision-making scenarios. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sorting through job applications at my kitchen table in Coventry. Laptop balanced between takeaway containers and bills I'd been avoiding since my redundancy 3 months earlier. At first glance, it looked like any other freelance opportunity, polite, professional, asking about my background in market research and whether I might be interested in participating in a consumer behavior study. The sender claimed to be conducting research into how adults discover and evaluate information sources, particularly in the digital age. It was the payment offer that caught my attention. £200 for a few hours of guided internet research, considerably more than I'd been earning from the occasional survey work that kept me barely solvent. The postscript made me pause, though. Given your background in consumer analysis, your insights into alternative information discovery methods would be particularly valuable. I'd never specialized in alternative information discovery. My market research experience was entirely conventional. Focus groups, consumer surveys, brand perception studies. Nothing that would suggest expertise in whatever they meant by alternative methods. I replied cautiously, asking for more details about the research project and what exactly they meant by alternative information discovery. The response came within hours, including what appeared to be legitimate academic credentials and a brief outline of their study into how consumers find information outside mainstream channels. They were particularly interested in how people without technical backgrounds navigate what they called unconventional information sources, content that exists beyond normal search engines and social media platforms, but doesn't require specialized knowledge to access. The research would involve guided exploration of various information communities, documenting my reactions and observations about content quality, reliability, and user experience, all conducted remotely with appropriate safety precautions. It seemed straightforward enough. I'd certainly spent enough time recently searching for job opportunities and financial advice through every possible channel. Understanding how people find reliable information in an ocean of digital noise was clearly valuable research. We arranged a video call for the following weekend. The researcher who appeared on screen looked exactly as I'd expected. Early 30s, professional but slightly academic, comfortable with technology. They asked thoughtful questions about my market research background, approaches to evaluating information reliability, experience with different types of online communities. About halfway through the interview, they shifted focus, asked whether I'd ever encountered information sources that seemed to exist parallel to mainstream internet content, communities or resources that weren't indexed by normal search engines but contained genuinely useful material. I admitted that during my recent job searching, I'd occasionally found leads through sources that weren't obvious from standard career websites. Nothing dramatic, just recommendations and opportunities that seemed to circulate through networks I wasn't normally part of. The researcher seemed particularly interested in this observation, asked whether I'd ever felt curious about these hidden networks, whether I'd considered exploring them more systematically to understand what information they contained. I explained that my technical knowledge was limited to basic computer use. I wouldn't know how to access hidden networks even if I wanted to. The researcher smiled and suggested this might actually be perfect for their research. They were looking for people who could document the experience of discovering hidden information communities from a complete beginner's perspective. Technical experts often had too much prior knowledge to provide genuine first-time reactions to what they found. Would I be interested in participating in guided exploration of some hidden information networks with detailed safety instructions to help them understand how non-technical adults might react to content that existed outside mainstream channels? The request felt like a natural extension of our discussion about information discovery. Understanding hidden networks would certainly be valuable knowledge, especially if they contained opportunities or resources that weren't available through conventional channels. They provided detailed instructions for accessing hidden services safely, emphasizing that we'd only visit communities focused on information sharing rather than anything obviously problematic. Academic research, essentially, conducted with proper precautions. The software installation was more complex than regular internet browsing, but their instructions were clear enough. that I managed it without major difficulty. They'd provided a list of addresses for communities they'd already verified as appropriate for research purposes. The first few sites were disappointingly mundane. Discussion groups about privacy rights, archives of historical documents, communities focused on information that had been censored or suppressed. Exactly the sort of content you'd expect researchers to study. But as I explored more widely, following links and recommendations from these initial communities, I began encountering material that was considerably more interesting from a market research perspective. Not illegal content, but documentation of business practices and corporate activities that weren't being reported through mainstream business media. Internal communications from major companies, documentation of regulatory violations, communities discussing market manipulation and consumer deception techniques. The researcher had asked me to document my reactions to this material, particularly focusing on how it might influence consumer decision-making. They were especially interested in psychological responses, what felt credible, what seemed actionable, how exposure might change someone's approach to purchasing decisions. I found myself spending hours exploring these hidden business communities, taking notes about information quality and community structures, trying to analyze what made certain claims feel more reliable than obvious conspiracy theories. Some communities hosted real-time discussions about corporate activities that weren't being covered in financial news. Others shared documentation of consumer rights violations that had been settled quietly without public disclosure. The line between legitimate business journalism and corporate conspiracy theories was often difficult to determine. One community that particularly caught my attention focused on what they called local business intelligence. Members sharing information about companies and organizations in their immediate geographic areas that wasn't appearing in local business press. The UK section contained posts about businesses in various cities and towns, often with financial documentation or regulatory filings supporting claims that weren't receiving broader attention. I found myself checking this community regularly, curious about whether anything would appear relating to Coventry or the West Midlands business community I was trying to break back into. About 3 weeks into my exploration, someone posted a series of documents that made my stomach drop. The files contained detailed financial information about the recruitment agency I'd been working with since my redundancy. Not just general business data, but specific records of their client relationships and fee structures that revealed practices that were definitely not being disclosed to job seekers. The post claimed that several local recruitment agencies were operating what amounted to employment fraud schemes, charging fees to employers for services that weren't being provided while manipulating job seekers into accepting positions that didn't match advertised terms. Most disturbing were internal communications, suggesting that some agencies were deliberately prolonging unemployment for certain candidates to maximize government subsidy payments while maintaining the appearance of active job placement efforts. I recognized names and companies from my own job search experience. Agencies that had promised opportunities that never materialized, positions that had been filled internally after lengthy application processes, interviews that seemed designed to waste time rather than evaluate candidates. The documentation suggested a systematic approach to exploiting both unemployed individuals and the government systems designed to support them. Professional fraud disguised as legitimate employment services. I should have reported the information to relevant authorities immediately, but I was concerned about explaining how I'd discovered the documents without revealing my participation in research that might be considered inappropriate or potentially illegal. Instead, I started paying closer attention to my interactions with recruitment agencies, looking for signs of the deceptive practices the hidden community had documented. I noticed things I'd previously attributed to normal business inefficiency. deliberately vague job descriptions that allowed agencies to claim positions had been filled by internal candidates, interview processes that seemed designed to gather personal information rather than assess qualifications, requirements for financial disclosure that weren't standard practice. Most significantly, I realized that several agencies had been coordinating their responses to my applications, ensuring that I remained in a cycle of near-miss opportunities that maintained hope while preventing actual employment. I began documenting these interactions more carefully, creating records of conversations and email exchanges that revealed patterns of deliberate manipulation. What I discovered confirmed the hidden community's allegations about systematic employment fraud. The agencies were indeed operating coordinated schemes designed to exploit both job seekers and government funding systems. They maintained databases of long-term unemployed individuals who could be cycled through fake opportunities to justify continued subsidy payments, while ensuring these people never actually obtained stable employment. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated, designed to maintain motivation and compliance while preventing the sort of genuine job placement that would remove candidates from the system. I researched the hidden community more thoroughly, trying to understand who was posting this information and why they were documenting employment fraud specifically. The community structure was more complex than I'd initially realized. Members weren't just sharing random business intelligence, but appeared to be conducting systematic investigation of corporate practices that weren't receiving official scrutiny. Some posts included detailed analysis of regulatory capture, suggesting that employment fraud was continuing because oversight bodies were staffed by people with financial interests in maintaining current systems. The documentation quality was often professional, including forensic accounting analysis and cross-referencing of information from multiple sources. This wasn't casual whistleblowing, but something approaching genuine investigative journalism. I found posts about similar employment fraud schemes in different cities, suggesting this wasn't isolated to Coventry, but part of a broader pattern affecting unemployed people across the UK. The scope indicated that employment fraud had become institutionalized, with government systems inadvertently funding schemes that perpetuated unemployment while appearing to address it. I started contributing my own documentation to the community, sharing evidence about recruitment agency practices without identifying specific individuals or companies. The response was immediate and encouraging. Other members provided additional context and suggested methods for gathering more comprehensive evidence. They also warned me about potential risks of investigating too openly. Several contributors mentioned experiencing retaliation after their documentation had led to official scrutiny. Blacklisting from employment agencies, credit rating problems, even legal threats from companies that didn't appreciate unwanted attention. The advice was to document carefully but discreetly, avoid direct confrontation with agencies involved in fraudulent practices, and be prepared for professional retaliation if my investigation became known to the wrong people. This advice proved prescient sooner than I'd expected. About a month after I'd started contributing to the community, I received a phone call that made it clear my activities hadn't gone unnoticed. Not through the hidden community itself, but from someone claiming to represent a professional standards body for recruitment agencies. A polite inquiry about my recent experiences with local employment services, asking whether I'd encountered any practices that concerned me. The caller included enough specific details about my job search activities to make it obvious that my interactions with various agencies had been more closely monitored than I'd realized. Someone had been tracking my applications, interview attendance, even my communication patterns with different agencies. They suggested a meeting to discuss my concerns in a confidential setting where I could provide feedback about recruitment industry practices without worrying about professional repercussions. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at a location away from any employment agency, a conference room in a business center that seemed designed for sensitive discussions requiring privacy. I should have declined the meeting and reported everything I discovered to proper authorities instead of participating in what felt increasingly like an investigation operating outside normal oversight. But I was curious about who these people were and what exactly they knew about my activities. More importantly, I needed to understand whether my employment prospects were being deliberately sabotaged and by whom. The meeting location was exactly as impersonal as I'd expected. Generic business center, anonymous conference room, the sort of space designed for discussions that participants might want to forget. 2 people were waiting when I arrived. Professional appearance, polite demeanor, the sort of individuals you might expect from any industry oversight body. They thanked me for coming and explained that they were investigating concerns about recruitment industry practices affecting long-term unemployed individuals. My documentation had been valuable, they assured me, helping them understand the scope of practices that weren't being properly regulated or reported through official channels. They asked detailed questions about what I'd experienced, which agencies I'd worked with, what documentation I'd gathered about their practices. Their knowledge of the recruitment industry was comprehensive, suggesting either extensive research or direct involvement in employment services. About halfway through the discussion, they shifted focus to my research activities. Asked about my exploration of hidden business communities, my participation in documentation projects, my communication with other people investigating employment fraud. They seemed particularly interested in the community where I'd first seen documents about recruitment agencies, asking whether I'd identified other contributors or learned about similar investigations in different regions. Their questions became increasingly specific about my technical knowledge and methods for accessing hidden services. Not accusatory, but thorough enough to suggest they understood exactly what I'd been doing and possibly who I'd been communicating with. Eventually, they explained the real purpose of our meeting. The practices I documented were part of an authorized pilot program studying long-term unemployment intervention strategies. The recruitment agencies were participating in research designed to understand how employment services could be improved for difficult-to-place candidates. The program was legitimate and properly approved, but necessarily discreet because public awareness might compromise the validity of behavioral research into unemployment patterns. My documentation had been noticed because it potentially threatened the integrity of ongoing research. Not because I discovered anything inappropriate, but because external scrutiny could alter participant behavior and invalidate months of careful data collection. They appreciated my concern about employment practices, but asked that I discontinue my documentation and avoid sharing information about the research through any channels, including hidden communities where I'd been contributing evidence. In exchange for my cooperation, they were prepared to provide priority placement through agencies that weren't participating in the research program, helping me obtain employment that wouldn't be affected by experimental intervention strategies. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about their approach made me uncomfortable. The level of detail they possessed about my hidden community participation suggested surveillance that went beyond casual monitoring of job search activities. I agreed to discontinue my documentation while privately resolving to research their claims more thoroughly before accepting their explanation. Over the next few weeks, I tried to verify the legitimacy of the research program they described, contacted government departments that might be conducting such studies, searched for published information about authorized employment intervention research. I found nothing that corroborated their explanation. No research projects matching their description. no government connections that could be verified, no official documentation of pilot programs involving recruitment agencies. Either the research was so sensitive that all information was classified, or the explanation had been fabricated to discourage my investigation. I returned to the hidden community to share my concerns about the meeting and seek advice about verifying official research claims. The response was immediate and alarming. Several community members reported similar experiences. Investigators or officials contacting them after they documented questionable business practices, providing explanations that couldn't be verified through normal channels. Some contributors had been threatened with legal action for sharing commercially sensitive information about authorized programs. Others had experienced employment difficulties or financial problems after refusing to stop their documentation activities. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to discourage investigation of practices that were operating without proper transparency or accountability. I started researching the business center where I'd attended the meeting, trying to understand who had access to their facilities and whether the people I'd met could be verified through legitimate channels. The center's booking records weren't publicly accessible, but staff mentioned that the room had been reserved by a consultancy firm that used their facilities regularly for client meetings requiring discretion. I researched the consultancy and found a professional website with generic services and no specific information about current projects or personnel. The sort of deliberately vague presentation that could cover almost any type of consulting work. Further investigation revealed connections between the consultancy and government contracts related to employment services, though the specific nature of their work wasn't clearly documented in public records. The hidden community provided additional context about similar organizations operating in other regions, consultancies with vague mandates and official connections, often involved in activities that seemed to operate outside normal oversight while maintaining plausible explanations for their work. I was beginning to understand that I'd stumbled across something considerably more complex than recruitment agency fraud. The employment practices I documented were likely part of a broader system designed to manage unemployment as an economic resource rather than a social problem to be solved. The hidden community had become a way for people to document and share information about these practices, creating alternative information networks for evidence that wasn't being reported through official channels. But it had also made us visible to people who had resources and motivation to monitor our activities and discourage our documentation. Last week, I found something in my flat that confirmed my worst suspicions about how closely I was being monitored. A small device, no larger than a USB drive, tucked behind my laptop where it wouldn't be noticed during normal use. Professional installation, designed to be invisible unless someone was specifically looking for surveillance equipment. When I researched the device online, I found it was sophisticated monitoring equipment capable of recording internet activity, email communications, and even ambient audio. The sort of surveillance that would document every website visited, every message sent, every conversation conducted near my computer. I'd been under comprehensive observation for months, possibly since I'd first started contributing to the hidden community. Everything I'd researched, everyone I'd communicated with, every piece of evidence I'd gathered had been monitored and recorded. The realization that my investigation had been watched from the beginning made me understand the true scope of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about employment fraud, but about a system capable of monitoring and controlling people who asked inconvenient questions about how economic systems really functioned. I removed the device but kept it in my desk drawer, unsure whether disposing of it would create additional problems or whether my discovery was being monitored through other methods I hadn't detected. The hidden community continues to operate, though several regular contributors have stopped posting and some documentation has been removed without explanation. Those of us who remain active share information more carefully, aware that our activities are being monitored by people with considerable resources and few obvious constraints. I'm still unemployed, still searching for legitimate opportunities, still wondering which agencies are genuine and which are part of systems designed to maintain unemployment while profiting from government funding intended to address it. But I'm also aware that my job search activities are being recorded, my internet research is being monitored, and my financial situation is being tracked by people who benefit from keeping certain individuals unemployed indefinitely. The link had been sitting in my inbox for 3 days before I opened it, mostly because I get so many random messages from anonymous users that I've learned to ignore most of them until I'm properly bored. I was 22 and working in the stockroom at a Sainsbury's in Preston, spending 8 hours a day moving boxes around and trying not to think too much about how this wasn't exactly where I'd imagined myself ending up after college. The pay was decent enough for what it was, but the work was mind-numbing in ways that made every shift feel like it lasted twice as long as it actually did. Most of my mental stimulation came from browsing message boards during breaks and lunch, anonymous forums where people shared interesting content, discussed topics that were too controversial for mainstream social media, posted things they'd discovered in the darker corners of the internet. I wasn't looking for anything particularly extreme, just wanted to read something more engaging than the usual social media nonsense that everyone else seemed satisfied with. Real discussions about real topics by people who weren't trying to maintain personal brands or worry about what their employers might think. The message boards I frequented attracted people who'd been banned from regular platforms or preferred not to use their real names when discussing sensitive subjects. Not necessarily criminals or extremists, just individuals who valued privacy and authentic conversation over performative social interaction. One board I visited regularly had a section for sharing unusual content that people had discovered during their online wanderings. Leaked documents, underground media, historical footage that had been suppressed or forgotten. The sort of material that demonstrated there was always more happening in the world than mainstream news sources bothered to report. The link had come through a private message from a stranger who claimed to have found something that would interest anyone serious about documenting authentic, extreme content. They'd noticed my posts in discussions about banned media and thought I might appreciate access to material that most people would never encounter. I'd received similar messages before from people wanting to share shocking videos or disturbing images they'd found somewhere online. Most turned out to be obviously fake content or things I'd already seen posted elsewhere. But the stranger's message was different, more measured, more focused on the documentary value of what they were offering rather than its shock potential. They explained that the link led to a streaming site that hosted live content from various hidden locations. Not recorded material, but real-time feeds showing events as they happened. The sort of authentic documentation that serious researchers valued for its immediacy and unfiltered nature. I should have been more suspicious about why someone would share access to exclusive streaming content with a random person from a message board. But I was curious, and my job gave me plenty of time to explore whatever caught my interest without worrying about productivity or professional consequences. The link led to a site with a basic interface showing multiple video feeds from different locations. Most were static or showed empty rooms, but a few had obvious activity suggesting they were genuinely live rather than pre-recorded loops. The video quality was better than I'd expected for streaming content, and the feeds updated regularly in ways that confirmed they were showing real-time events rather than edited footage. Professional equipment and reliable internet connections rather than amateur recordings from phone cameras. One feed showed what appeared to be a basement or converted garage space with someone restrained in the center of the frame. The timestamp indicated it was happening live, and occasionally I could see movement that confirmed the person was conscious and aware of their situation. I watched for about 20 minutes during my lunch break, telling myself I was documenting whether this type of content actually existed, rather than just consuming it for entertainment. The academic approach that people on the message boards always claim to take when discussing extreme material. Around the edges of the video feed, I could see interface elements that suggested this was part of a larger streaming platform. Chat functions, viewer counters, menu options that implied there were additional feeds available to people with appropriate access levels. The chat showed comments from maybe 30 other viewers discussing what they were seeing with the clinical detachment of people analyzing documentary footage. No obvious excitement about violence, just matter-of-fact observations about technical aspects of the setup. What made me pay closer attention was a detail in the background of the main feed. On the wall behind the restrained figure was a poster that looked familiar, a local council notice about planning applications that I'd seen around Preston. The format and official logos were definitely from Preston City Council, the sort of bureaucratic signage you see in public buildings and commercial properties throughout the area, which suggested this feed was showing events happening locally rather than in some distant foreign location. Over the next few days, I found myself checking the streaming site regularly to see if the feeds had changed or if new content was available. The interface seemed to update on an irregular schedule, with different rooms becoming active at different times. Most of the locations looked similar. Basement or garage spaces with concrete walls and industrial lighting, but the background details varied enough to suggest they were different physical locations rather than the same room filmed from different angles. I started paying attention to these background details, looking for clues about where the feeds might be originating. Council notices, business signage, architectural features that might indicate specific geographic areas. Several feeds showed details that suggested UK locations, electrical fittings, building materials, even glimpses of packaging that looked typically British. But one feed in particular kept showing elements that seemed specifically local to the Preston area. Not just the council poster, but other details that I recognized from around town. A particular type of street lighting visible through a small window, road markings that matched local standards, even background sounds that seemed consistent with urban Lancashire rather than anywhere foreign. The possibility that live violent content was being streamed from locations near where I lived and worked made everything feel more immediate and disturbing. This wasn't abstract criminal activity happening somewhere else. It could be occurring within a few miles of where I was sitting in the Sainsbury's stockroom. I started researching whether there had been any local missing person reports that might correspond to people I'd seen in the feeds. Without clear physical descriptions or specific dates, it was impossible to make definitive connections, but there seemed to be more unexplained disappearances than you'd normally expect in an area the size of Preston. One case particularly bothered me because the missing person had last been seen in an area I knew well. They disappeared after leaving work at a retail park about 10 minutes from where I worked, and despite extensive searches and media appeals, no trace had been found. The timing roughly corresponded to when I'd first started accessing the streaming site, and the physical description matched someone I thought I'd seen in one of the feeds. The connection was too vague to be certain. but disturbing enough to make me wonder if other viewers had noticed similar patterns. I considered reporting what I discovered to the police, but I knew how that conversation would sound. Supermarket worker claims to have found evidence of live murder streams while browsing anonymous message boards during lunch breaks. They'd probably assume I was having mental health issues or making up stories for attention. More importantly, I was worried about what might happen if the people behind the streams discovered that someone was connecting their content to real-world missing person cases. I'd been accessing their site regularly for weeks, possibly leaving digital traces that could be used to identify me. The stranger had warned me that accessing hidden streaming content required understanding how to protect your identity from people who might not appreciate unwanted attention. Knowledge I clearly didn't possess, despite having been granted access to material that was obviously intended for a select audience. About a month after first accessing the streaming site, I received another message from the stranger asking whether I'd found the content educational and if I was interested in additional material that wasn't available to general viewers. Their tone was friendly but felt more personal than our previous communication, as if they knew something about my response to the content that they hadn't mentioned before, or had been monitoring my viewing patterns more closely than I'd realized. I replied cautiously, saying that I'd found the material academically interesting but disturbing on a personal level. I tried to sound thoughtful rather than frightened, hoping to maintain access while expressing some reservations about the content. Their response came back within hours, which suggested they'd been online waiting for my reply, rather than just checking messages occasionally. They said they understood my concerns, but reminded me that serious documentation sometimes required confronting uncomfortable realities. They offered to provide access to additional feeds that would help me develop a more comprehensive understanding of how such content was created and distributed. Something about the way they phrased the offer made me uncomfortable, as if my continued viewing was expected rather than voluntary, and declining might have consequences I wouldn't like. I didn't reply immediately, telling myself I needed time to think about whether I wanted to continue accessing content that was clearly illegal and potentially connected to local criminal activity. But I kept checking for new messages, worried that not responding quickly enough might be interpreted as rejection or lack of appreciation for the exclusive access I'd been granted. The next day at work, I noticed someone I didn't recognize hanging around the car park during my lunch break. Nothing obviously suspicious, just someone who seemed to be waiting for something or observing the area more carefully than you'd expect from casual visitors. They were positioned where they could see the staff entrance but weren't obviously watching it. The sort of surveillance that would be easy to dismiss as coincidence unless you were already paranoid about being monitored. I mentioned it to one of my colleagues, who said they'd noticed the same person on previous days but assumed they were waiting for someone or had legitimate business in the area. The sort of explanation that made perfect sense unless you had reasons to be concerned about unwanted attention. Over the next week, I started noticing other small things that individually meant nothing but collectively made me uncomfortable. Post-delivered at unusual times, items in my flat that seemed to have been moved slightly, sounds outside my door that could have been coincidence but felt like surveillance. One evening, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my door while I was at work. Inside was a single photograph that made my hands shake as I looked at it. The photograph showed me walking from my flat to the bus stop, taken from a concealed position that suggested professional surveillance rather than casual observation. Someone had been watching me closely enough to document my daily routine without me noticing anything obviously suspicious. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message that made the situation clear. interesting viewing habits, no signature, no return address. Just those 3 words that made it obvious someone knew about my access to the streaming site and had been monitoring my activities as a result. I threw the photograph away and tried to convince myself it was a scare tactic designed to prevent me from reporting what I'd discovered. But I couldn't explain how someone had obtained detailed knowledge of my movements or managed to deliver the message without being noticed. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid about being watched. Every stranger in the supermarket felt threatening. Every unexpected sound in my flat made me check the windows and doors. But nothing obvious happened. No more photographs, no threatening messages, no signs that anyone was following me or monitoring my activities beyond what had already been demonstrated. I stopped accessing the streaming site and tried to focus on normal work and social activities. But I couldn't shake the knowledge of what I'd seen, or the fear that I'd gotten involved in something more serious than casual browsing of extreme content. The person I'd noticed in the car park disappeared around the same time I stopped visiting the site. Either they'd found what they were looking for, or whoever was behind the surveillance had decided I was no longer worth monitoring. But I still think about those feeds, and the casual way the chat participants had discussed real violence as if it were documentary footage rather than live criminal activity. How many other people might be accessing similar content without understanding the risks involved in connecting it to real-world events? And I think about the stranger, and whether they were genuinely sharing interesting content with fellow researchers or deliberately drawing people into situations they weren't equipped to handle safely. Sometimes I wonder if receiving that link was as random as it seemed, or if someone had been monitoring the message boards long enough to identify people who might be curious about extreme content but naive about the consequences of accessing it. The link is still in my message history, though I've never tried to access it again. Sometimes I'm tempted to see if the site is still active, if the same feeds are running, if other people are still watching and commenting as if real violence were just another form of online entertainment. But mostly, I try to pretend I never saw it, never accessed those feeds, never connected what I was watching to missing people from my own area. Because acknowledging what I know would mean accepting that some of the most disturbing content online isn't created in distant countries by foreign criminals, but by people who might live in the same town, shop in the same places, walk the same streets as everyone else. Even now, after all this time, I can still see the one face that wasn't covered, mouth wide open in genuine terror, eyes bulging as they realized what was about to happen to them, while hundreds of people watched online. The laptop was sitting on a table next to some old textbooks and children's toys at a car boot sale in Wakefield, priced at £40 by an elderly man who seemed eager to get rid of it. He explained that it had belonged to his son, who'd moved abroad for work, and left behind various items he didn't want to ship overseas. It was a Saturday morning in October, the sort of crisp autumn day that brings out dozens of sellers hoping to clear their garages and lofts before winter. I was there looking for books and teaching materials that might be useful for my Year 6 classroom. At 31, I'd been teaching primary school long enough to know that stretching your budget meant weekend trips to car boot sales and charity shops, hunting for resources that the school's funding couldn't cover. It was a Saturday morning in October, and I'd gone to a car boot sale looking for books and teaching materials that might be useful for my classroom. The sort of weekend activity that teachers do when they're trying to make their budget stretch further than the school's funding allows. The laptop looked to be in decent enough condition despite being a few years old, and £40 seemed reasonable for something that would let me work from home without having to carry my school laptop back and forth every day. The man threw in a charger and carrying case, pleased to have found someone who'd actually used the machine rather than just wanting it for parts. I didn't bother checking it thoroughly at the sale, just confirmed it would power on and seemed to be functioning normally. When I got home, I plugged it in and started setting it up for my own use, planning to wipe the existing user account and install fresh software. But when I accessed the previous owner's files to back up anything that might be important before deleting them, I found folders with names that immediately made me uncomfortable. Video files, communication logs, and software I didn't recognize, all organized in ways that suggested activities the previous owner hadn't mentioned to his father. One folder contained what appeared to be streaming software and technical documentation for broadcast equipment. Professional quality programs that would cost hundreds of pounds and weren't the sort of thing you'd expect someone to have unless they were seriously involved in content creation. Another folder contained correspondence with people using usernames rather than real names, discussing technical aspects of hosting and distribution that were carefully worded but clearly referred to activities that weren't entirely legal. The third folder contained video files that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the list. Recordings of what appeared to be live streams, showing dark rooms with industrial equipment and bound figures, the sort of content that explained why someone might want to get rid of a laptop without properly wiping the hard drive. I opened one of the files and immediately understood that I was looking at something the previous owner had created rather than just downloaded. The camera work was deliberate, the audio quality was professional, and in the background I could hear a voice giving instructions that sounded like it belonged to someone who was clearly in control of the situation. The video showed a basement space with concrete walls and harsh lighting, containing equipment that was obviously designed for restraint and violence, rather than any legitimate purpose. Most disturbing was the casual, businesslike tone of the voice directing what was happening off camera. I closed the file and sat in my kitchen trying to process what I'd discovered. The polite elderly man at the car boot sale had unknowingly sold me evidence of what appeared to be serious criminal activity conducted by his son. Over the next few hours, I went through more of the files and correspondence on the laptop. The scope of the previous owner's activities was larger than I'd initially realized. Multiple locations, regular scheduling, sophisticated technical setup. This wasn't occasional dabbling in extreme content. It was a substantial ongoing enterprise. Some of the correspondence included references to participants and equipment that made it clear the previous owner wasn't working alone. He was part of a group that shared resources and technical knowledge, though the communications were careful never to use real names or specific addresses. What bothered me most wasn't just the criminal nature of what I'd discovered, but the professional way it had been documented. Detailed logs of events, technical specifications for equipment, even what appeared to be financial records tracking expenses and income. The previous owner had been running what amounted to a business, complete with the sort of administrative overhead you'd expect from any legitimate enterprise. Except instead of providing normal services, he'd been creating violent content for audiences willing to pay for access to live streams. I found files containing schedules that suggested regular broadcasts over a period of several years. Different locations were used on rotating basis, with detailed notes about equipment setup and technical requirements for each venue. Most of the locations were identified only by codes rather than actual addresses, but some files contained photographs that showed enough detail to suggest they were commercial or industrial properties rather than residential spaces. One set of photos showed a warehouse or factory unit with distinctive architectural features that looked familiar in ways I couldn't immediately place. The building style, the window design, even the surrounding landscape seemed like something I'd seen before, though I couldn't remember where. I spent the rest of the weekend researching what I could find online about the type of content the previous owner had been creating. Most sources dismissed red rooms as internet mythology, but a few seemed to have genuine knowledge about how such activities might function in practice. The technical requirements, legal risks, and financial resources needed to maintain live violent streaming were considerable. Someone would need partners with complementary skills, multiple secure locations, and sophisticated methods for avoiding detection by law enforcement. Which meant the mild-mannered son, whose laptop I'd bought, was actually involved in running what amounted to a criminal enterprise, with all the risks that implied for anyone who might accidentally discover evidence of their activities. On Monday morning, I tried to focus on normal teaching responsibilities while privately wrestling with what to do about my discovery. Reporting the previous owner to police would require explaining how I'd obtained the evidence and potentially compromising any investigation they might want to conduct. But continuing to possess the laptop felt like becoming an accessory to criminal activity, even though my discovery had been entirely accidental and I had no intention of using the material for any purpose. During my lunch break, I researched local missing person reports to see if any cases might correspond to people who appeared in the video files. Without clear physical descriptions or specific dates, it was impossible to make definitive connections, but there seemed to be more unexplained disappearances than you'd normally expect in the Wakefield area. One case particularly disturbed me because the missing person had been a teacher at a school not far from mine. They disappeared about 8 months earlier after leaving work on what should have been a routine Friday afternoon, and despite extensive searches and media appeals, no trace had been found. I researched the case more thoroughly and found that the missing teacher had been someone with a similar profile to myself. Single, living alone, following predictable routines that would make them easy to observe and potentially target. The possibility that someone in my own profession might have become a victim in the content I discovered made everything feel personal in ways I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about accidentally finding evidence of criminal activity. It was about people who lived lives similar to mine being targeted for reasons I didn't understand. That evening, I decided to look more carefully at the warehouse photos I'd found on the laptop, trying to identify where they might have been taken. The architectural style and surrounding environment provided enough clues to narrow down the possible locations to specific areas around Yorkshire. One photo showed a view from inside the warehouse, looking out through a loading bay door. In the distance, I could see a distinctive church spire and what appeared to be a retail park that looked familiar from somewhere I'd visited recently. I spent hours comparing the photo to online maps and street view images, trying to identify the specific location. The combination of the church spire, retail park, and surrounding landscape eventually led me to an area about 20 minutes from Wakefield. The warehouse was in an industrial estate that I'd driven past many times without paying particular attention to the individual buildings. But now that I knew what to look for, I could see how the location would be perfect for activities that required privacy and security. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively researching the industrial estate and the businesses that operated there. Most were legitimate companies with normal commercial activities, but several units appeared to be vacant or underutilized based on their online presence. I decided to drive past the area during the weekend, telling myself I was just curious to see if I could identify the specific building from the photos. The industrial estate was mostly quiet on Saturday afternoon, with only a few cars in the various car parks. The warehouse I'd identified from the photos was clearly vacant, with for lease signs and boarded windows, but there were fresh tire tracks in the car park and what appeared to be utility connections that suggested power and water were still active, despite the building being officially empty. From the road, everything looked completely abandoned, but knowing what I potentially knew about how the space might be used made it feel sinister in ways that were difficult to explain. I parked and walked around the perimeter of the building, looking for any obvious signs of recent activity. Most of the windows were boarded up, but one loading bay had a small gap where I could see inside. The interior had been cleared of most equipment, but I could see mounting points on the walls where cameras had obviously been positioned, and electrical installations that weren't typical of standard warehouse fittings. Someone had spent considerable time and money converting the space for specific purposes that weren't related to normal commercial storage or manufacturing. The sort of professional installation that suggested serious long-term planning rather than temporary use. As I was photographing the mounting points through the gap in the boarding, I heard a car pulling into the car park behind me. I turned around to see a van parking near the building's main entrance. 2 people got out and began unloading equipment that looked like cameras and lighting gear. They moved with the efficiency of people who were familiar with the location and had done this setup many times before. I should have left immediately and reported what I was seeing to the authorities, but I was curious about whether this was connected to the content I'd found on the laptop, and whether I was witnessing the continuation of activities that I'd assumed had ended when the previous owner moved abroad. I moved to a position where I could observe without being seen, watching as the 2 people systematically set up what appeared to be a professional filming operation inside the supposedly abandoned warehouse. They worked for about an hour, positioning equipment and testing various technical systems. Around 6 o'clock, another vehicle arrived with what appeared to be additional personnel and someone who seemed to be having difficulty walking steadily. That's when I realized I wasn't just witnessing the setup for content creation. I was potentially watching the preparation for another live stream, like the ones I'd seen recorded on the laptop. I fumbled for my phone to call the police, but as I was trying to dial, one of the people setting up equipment looked directly at me through the gap where I was watching. Our eyes met for several seconds before they calmly walked over to speak to one of their colleagues, pointing in my direction while continuing what appeared to be a normal conversation about their work. I ran back to my car and drove home as quickly as possible, hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. Someone involved in creating violent content had seen me observing their activities and hadn't seemed particularly concerned about being witnessed. Either they were confident that I wouldn't report what I'd seen, or they had methods for dealing with unwanted attention that didn't require immediate panic or dramatic responses. That evening, I tried to decide whether to contact the police about what I'd witnessed. The evidence from the laptop combined with what I'd seen at the warehouse should be enough to justify an investigation, even if my story about accidentally discovering criminal activity sounded unlikely. But I was worried about what might happen if the people I'd observed discovered that someone had connected their current activities to evidence from the previous owner's laptop. They demonstrated professional competence and lack of concern about being witnessed, which suggested they had experience dealing with potential problems. I spent the next week trying to maintain normal teaching routines while privately wrestling with the knowledge of what I'd discovered and witnessed. Every unexpected sound outside my house made me check the windows. Every stranger who seemed to look in my direction felt potentially threatening. but nothing obvious happened. No threatening messages, no signs that anyone was following me or monitoring my activities. Just the persistent feeling that people who went to such lengths to maintain secure locations might take additional steps to protect their interests from exposure. 2 weeks after visiting the warehouse, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my front door while I was at work. Inside was a single photograph that made my stomach drop as I looked at it. The photograph showed me taking pictures through the gap in the warehouse boarding, clearly taken by someone who had been positioned to observe my activities without me realizing they were there. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message that made the situation clear. Curiosity satisfied. No signature, no return address, just those 2 words that made it obvious someone wanted me to understand that my investigation had been noticed and documented. I threw the photograph away and tried to convince myself it was a warning designed to prevent me from reporting what I'd discovered rather than a prelude to more serious consequences. But I couldn't explain how they'd identified me or obtained my home address based on a brief observation at the warehouse. Either they had considerably more resources than I'd assumed, or they'd been monitoring my activities more closely than the photograph alone suggested. I never reported what I'd found on the laptop or witnessed at the warehouse. The risks of becoming involved in an investigation seemed to outweigh the potential benefits of helping to stop criminal activity that might continue regardless of my intervention. But I still think about that face in the video file. The one person who wasn't wearing a mask or hood, who had looked directly into the camera with an expression that suggested they knew exactly who might be watching. And I think about the casual way the people at the warehouse had reacted to being observed, as if unwanted attention was just another technical problem to be managed, rather than a serious threat to their activities. Sometimes I wonder how many other people have accidentally discovered evidence of similar activities, and whether they reported what they found or stayed quiet like I did, too frightened of the consequences to risk becoming involved in something they didn't understand.